Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 117. This is going to be a particularly special episode, because we're going to try something new. In the previous episode, we took a look at the Symphyla and the Parapoda, those two clades of primitive, cryptic myriapods who live in leaf litter, carpets of moss, decaying logs, and in soil all around the world, from tropical jungles to temperate forests to tundra and taiga. I ended that episode by discussing their diet and how they contribute to the ecosystem in a really valuable way by recycling dead biomass and resupplying the soil with nutrients. At various points throughout the episode, I mentioned things about the soil, its evolution, its characteristics, how it's altered by vegetation, and so on. These were all but tantalizing hints of what was to come, as today, in honor of the ground-dwelling myriapods and all the other soil-dwelling creatures, we're going to explore the soil as a biome. You can think of this as a kind of combo episode, which will discuss material from pretty much every single major topic we've covered so far in the entire podcast, all in the context of the soil, this humble, brown, clumpy stuff that covers so much of the terrestrial surface of the world. While every type of soil contains various inorganic compounds and substances, like dust and small rocks, flakes of minerals, sand, sediment, silt, gravel, that kind of thing, a significant portion of the soil is organic material, biomass, living or dead. To clarify, in this special episode on the soil biome, I'll be looking at soil through a biological lens. Now, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a mineral scientist, and I'm not trying to make this a geology lesson. So we'll look at the mineral aspects of the soil a little bit, but mostly only as it pertains to things like water drainage, aeration, and other properties that are relevant to living organisms. Just imagine all of the small animals like beetles, ants, earthworms, and millipedes, to all of the microfauna, the microscopic animals like mites, nematodes, and tardigrades, that live and die in burrows and tunnels and the void spaces within the soil. In life, all of their waste, like feces or nitrate pellets or bits and pieces of shed exoskeletons, it all adds organic material back into the environment, including valuable inorganic nutrients like phosphorus. And in death, all of those little bodies add up to a huge amount of biomass. Soft-bodied things, like earthworms, dissolve into nutrient-rich goop that can be slurped up by everything from microbes to fungi to spiders, flies, and beetles. Harder-bodied things, like arthropods with their exoskeletons, or small snails with their shells, are often desiccated and brittle, fractured and ground up, crumbling apart and washed away in the rain, all in the natural ecological process of returning one's life essence, one's own biomass and chemical energy, back to the soil. Then there's all the vegetation, all the plants and fungi, whose roots and mycelia bind up the earth and create patches of stability that can resist washout from rivers, rain, or floods. Imagine the steady pace of fungal decomposition, affecting every log, every branch and leaf that touches the ground, all as part of a great water-assisted, decades-long process of vegetable biomass recycling. Fungi reinvigorates the soil with nutrients, which feeds new vegetation, which eventually dies and rots and returns the nutrients back to the soil again, over and over for millions of years, in perpetuity. The soil layer really is an amazing and incredible biome that's as complex as it is diverse. And in terms of its value to living things, the soil ranks up there with the major players, next to oxygen and water itself. It is profoundly important to life on Earth, which is why the soil deserves a special episode of its very own. And I figured that here, in the middle of this series on the myriapods, would be the perfect place for it, to provide, if nothing else, a little bit of environmental context for the millipedes, the centipedes, and their paropod and symphylan cousins. Okay, now you might not really care that much about dirt. I mean, it's always there. It's brownish, or reddish, or a plain tan color. It can be fluffy and soft. It can be gritty and rough. Sometimes it's more sandy, or more silty, or it may be full of clay. The soil doesn't really make noise, unless you walk on it or get down on the ground to listen to the creatures crawling around within it. It's just dirt. That's about it. What else is there to see? I mean, who cares, right? If that happens to be something close to what you're thinking, just give me a chance to explain how complex and dynamic the soil biome really is, and I guarantee that you'll be surprised and amazed. While I was doing the research for this episode, there was like 100 times where I was surprised by some incredible detail, or confused by the sheer chemical complexity of it all. Soil is amazing. It's incredible stuff, and if I can do my job right, I'll totally redefine how you perceive and think about this particular habitat, and you'll never be able to walk on the soil the same way again. So let's get started. Let's begin with the generation of the first soils and the initial evolution of the soil biome. I touched on this topic very briefly in the last episode, but today we'll really get into it. So let's begin with the earliest days of the Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, when the planet was still fresh and hot, right out of the cosmic oven. The newborn Earth was a roiling hellhouse of volcanism for tens of millions of years. After the initial planetary formation, there was an atmosphere of superheated rock vapors, which eventually condensed into a fine dust and settled to the surface. The surface itself was hot and totally inhospitable for millions of years, as the crust itself was still forming and cooling, replete with vast reservoirs of magma, erupting and resurfacing massive chunks of the young world with new lava. The crust churned with a constant, high-paced turnover. And alongside the hellish birth of the crust came the genesis of the oceans, as water precipitated out of the atmosphere and melted out of primordial ice that had been around since the formation of the solar system. The melting of massive pieces of ice within the crust and the mass displacement of flowing meltwater would have contributed to the mechanical instability of the mineral surface. Even though the early Earth was extremely hot, nearly 230 degrees Celsius, or close to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a literal oven, there was also so much CO2 in the atmosphere, and so much water vapor, nitrogen, hydrogen, and other gases, that the surface pressure was 27 times what it is today. This extreme pressure meant that water could stay in a liquid state despite the roiling heat. Just like the crust, the newborn oceans roiled and boiled and churned and steamed for millions of years. Huge quantities of CO2 were pulled out of the atmosphere and dissolved into the oceans, where they formed carbonic acid. This brought the ocean's pH down to around 5.5. The decreasing CO2 in the atmosphere reduced the greenhouse effect and lowered global temperatures, and by about 4 billion years ago, give or take, the world had somewhat calmed down. Temperatures were more normal as we would know them today, and the world had stabilized from its extremely stormy, steaming, volcanic, earthquake-riddled, boiling ocean's birth to a somewhat more calm, semi-stormy, sometimes steaming, sometimes volcanic, terrestrial infancy. And all this time, the terrestrial surface itself was bare mineral. It was naked bedrock. The raw expulsions of the Earth, these enclosed reservoirs of magma erupting to the surface, where they spread out into fields of lava and solidified into stone, lay under the ultraviolet eye of our young sun. The wind swept across these rocks, slowly eroding them over millions of years and contributing to a thin layer of dust. The rain worked faster, feeding rivers and carving channels in the rock, carrying silt downstream and depositing mineral compounds into the oceans. Near to the coastlines, waves beat against rocky shores and washed up layer upon layer of primeval sediments, creating the earliest sandy beaches. Eventually, there developed a layer of mineral debris spread across the crust, a product of the universal forces of erosion that worked in all places across the surface. However, these were not the first soils. Although, the mixing of small mineral particles into the ocean may have provided a sufficient chemical environment to give rise to runaway chains of organic chemical reactions, and this in turn could give rise to life itself. Perhaps these inflowing sediments provided some sort of stabilizing effect on the ocean's pH, or it was like a buffer where it upped its salinity to a level where salts and mineral nutrients were plentiful but not to the point of toxicity. Perhaps these dissolved mineral particles were more reactive and bioavailable for direct participation in early proto-biochemistries. In other words, the high surface area to volume ratio created a large total surface area where organic chemical reactions could happen, and where some of these inorganic mineral particles, for example, certain metals that have catalytic properties, and because they're all small particles being dissolved into the water column, you have a lot of surface area. There's a lot of room for reactivity here, and so this is a very chemically fertile environment. There's some hypothesizing that this kind of early aquatic environment could have been where life originated. This connection is possible, but it remains deeply speculative. In any case, at some point between 4 and 3.7 billion years ago, life emerged, likely in the boiling depths of some deep-sea hydrothermal vent. These first simple cells probably used the inner walls of the vent as a catalytic surface to engage in a wide variety of biochemical reactions, like redox reactions that shuttled energetic electrons around and facilitated the formation of larger, more complex compounds. You might be wondering, why is the genesis of life in a deep-sea hydrothermal vent more likely than with dissolved particles near the beaches or in the upper strata of the water column? Well, the answer has to do with energy flow. The hydrothermal vent is pumping out an enormous amount of energy. The water coming out is usually extremely hot, and it's very rich in metal particles, like various sulfur-containing compounds, and these can be captured and used in organic reactions as catalysts and structural components, and a variety of other things. You might have these materials in the upper strata of the water column where some of these dissolved particles coming in from rainwater and washout and stuff are being brought into the marine ecosystem, but you don't have the energy flow, the raw thermal and chemical energy that you have coming out of a deep-sea hydrothermal vent. In any case, these early cells that likely emerged in a deep-sea hydrothermal vent would evolve new traits and greater complexity, and they would have eventually spread out from their hydrothermal vent home and colonized the oceans and the seafloor. After all, water is being pumped out of this vent at a pretty high rate, and a lot of these organic reactions, a lot of this organic material like these early cells are going to get swept up in that current, carried out in the plume, and deposited somewhere else out there in the oceans. Eventually, this deep-sea early life began to spread outward across the seafloor, mixing into the seawater and growing ever higher up the continental shelves. Life would soon reach high enough in the water column to feel the light of the sun. The heat and the energy in sunlight and the cyclical rotation of day and night began to have direct effects on life itself. Photosynthesis was evolved as these early microbes developed protein complexes capable of fixing carbon by harnessing the energy in sunlight. This abundant solar energy, as well as the chemical fertility near the surface, encouraged a new pulse, a new proliferation of this early life. In time, great bacterial mats grew along the coastline, forming stromatolites. Endosymbionts formed, creating the first eukaryotic cells. Ancestral photosynthesizers filled the atmosphere with oxygen, producing an ozone layer that protected the surface from UV radiation. And for nearly 2 billion years, this was the status quo. A watery world with a rocky terrestrial surface whose coastal edges were coated in thick, stinking, mucousy mats of bacteria. These shallow water and coastal habitats were exposed to sunlight, encouraging the proliferation of photosynthetic algae. They would eventually evolve into the first non-vascular plants, which would colonize deeper inland And by deeper inland, I mean into some of the truly terrestrial areas immediately adjacent to bodies of water like lakes and rivers. But first, long before those early bryophytes emerged, the fungi did. The fungi emerged sometime between 900 million and 1.5 billion years ago, and for the first few 100 million years of that time, they were entirely aquatic. The fungi were an exclusively marine group of organisms. But eventually, like their bacterial forebears, they moved towards the land, and many lineages eventually left the entire marine environment behind. The oldest terrestrial fungi that we have fossils of were recovered from the early Silurian period, approximately 440 million years ago. These fossils belong to a species called Tortatubus protuberans, which was a filamentous fungi that saprophytically dissolved and soaked up nutrients from the bacterial mats. Now, the fungi also moved deeper inland, to the rougher landscapes, farther from the sea. This was really important because the fungi began to accelerate the biologically mediated breakdown of the bare mineral surface. They had two primary methods by which this could be accomplished. First, the fungi are saprophytes, which means they exude digestive chemicals outside of their bodies, and this breaks down their food, or a substrate, and dissolves it into a liquidy goop which they can then absorb. These digestive chemicals include chelating acids that are strong enough to chew through rock. Dissolving minerals with these chelating chemicals yields nutrients, like metal ions. These metal ions can be dissolved in water and absorbed by the fungus. It'll then carry the nutrients along its hyphae and spread them out across its mycelia to facilitate its own growth and sustenance. The fungi can extract these nutrients, and by distributing them across their mycelia, they're also physically moving the nutrients across a wide geographic area. When the fungi dies, or part of it is destroyed, those distributed nutrients couched in biomass end up scattered across the surface. It's a slow but quite reliable nutrient distribution and soil enrichment mechanism, although at this point, there still wasn't really true soils yet. Now, the second method by which fungi break down rocks is by literally growing into them. The fungal hyphae are filaments that are just a single cell wide and many cells long. They're extremely fine, and they can grow in between the grains in a rock. As the hyphae creep into the mineral, their growth applies pressure to the outside environment, pressures that are calculated to be in excess of 3,500 pounds per square inch at the very forward tip of the hyphae. This is strong enough to make the rock yield, to crack and break. Together, the chemical and mechanical breakdown of the rock by the fungi began the process of creating the first true soils. These early primitive substrates were mostly composed of the straight rock that was being splintered and eroded, but there was also a growing biological component, made up of the decayed biomass of old, long-dead mycelia that had rotted away into mush. This water-mineral-fungal mush mixture accumulated, building up to eventually create thick layers of primitive, nutrient-enriched soil. The bacterial mats were similarly thick and nutrient-enriched, but they aren't considered soil because they really didn't have a heavy mineral component. They were more a thick buildup of secretions and exudates and stuff from these massive populations of microbes. It wasn't so much a mixture of inorganic regolith with biological components. But that's what you start to see here with the fungi. If we go with the oldest estimates for fungal colonization of the land, which is about 900 million to a billion years ago, then 500 to 600 million years is how long the fungi would have had free reign of the terrestrial surface before the first land plants evolved. Just imagine these ancient fungi moving minerals around and building up soils in quiet solitude for 600 million years. Now bring your attention back to the mats of bacteria that have been growing along the shallow water coastal area for billions of years. Across this vast time period, across the life of the bacterial mats, photosynthesis evolved, algae emerged, and algae began to concentrate near coastal and riparian and other shallow water areas. From here, the algae began to taste some of the fungi-enriched soils on dry land. To summarize a lot of evolutionary change in just a few sentences, the algae gave rise to the first land plants, like bryophytes, that were non-vascular, lumpy little plants that looked like larger, bumpy, fluffy, flaky, or more mutated algae. These early plant lineages eventually evolved vascularity, allowing them to more efficiently transport water to move it farther and to grow larger. They evolved root systems, which penetrated the soil and fed from it. Root systems quickly evolved mutualistic symbioses with fungi to exchange some of the surplus sugars from photosynthesis for the mineral nutrients and the water that the fungi could more easily extract from the soil. In short order, the land plants gave rise to ferns and then gymnosperm seed plants, and eventually, much later, the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Now, as the plants diversified and radiated, they came to have profound ecological impacts on the world around them. Deciduous leaves that dropped every fall became a regular source of nutritional replenishment for the soil. Root systems that reached deep into the ground could pull up water and hydrate otherwise dry, barren soils. Root chemistry altered the soil chemistry, neutralizing the pH and making it a generally more hospitable biome. Loose soil that may have been washed off in a rainstorm or a flood could be held together by the reticulating root system of big plants like trees, which ultimately can affect the course of entire rivers as they push their way down through a landscape and erode the softer, less stable parts of the soil substrate. And of course, the plants were a source of food for the many herbivorous animals that would evolve out of the water in due time, and who would enrich the soil in their own way, with their shed scales and hair, bones and exoskeletons, and of course, a lifetime of feces. When larger tetrapods started to evolve, their poop became an increasingly greater fraction of the soil biomass, as well as an increasingly important ecological resource and vector for nutrient cycling. But we're not quite there yet. We still have many millions of years to go. About 430 to 450 million years ago, myriapods transitioned onto dry land. The oldest land myriapod, and thus the oldest land animal ever found, is the millipede, Pneumodesmus pneumani, whose fossils date back to the late Silurian period, about 428 million years ago. In reality, the earliest land animal was probably some kind of microfauna, some kind of extremely small, soil-bound invertebrate, some sort of microfauna like that was actually the first land animal. But their fossils are so tiny and so unlikely to survive that they've just never been discovered. We talked about this in the previous episode, but it was probably, the first land animal was probably an ancestral symphylan, or pauropod. So the fact remains that this large millipede is the oldest land animal that we know of for sure, that we have concrete, hard evidence of, but we must recognize the limits of our knowledge here. Anyway, the addition of the animals was another shocking change for terrestrial biomes. Now the soil wasn't just being built up by the activity of fungal decomposition and by plants producing leaf litter and cellulose-rich detritus. Now we also had animals filling the soil with their bodies and their body parts, all their secretions and exudates and lost scales and hair, and of course their feces. In addition, animal behaviors mechanically altered the soil. All of that digging and shoveling and burrowing and tunneling physically mixes up the upper layers of the soil, and it creates new channels and void spaces for air and water. So here we can see the initial evolution of the soils. The stage was set with the physical processes of rain and wind eroding rock to create a layer of dust, only for this to be joined by the activity of bacterial colonies and rock-dissolving fungi. The fungi built up the soils far enough to facilitate the evolution of the land plants. They were descendants of the algae and the bryophytes, who really could invade this new biome and spread out their roots, start altering soil chemistry. They really start to make important contributions to soil composition and ecology. And this, in turn, this colonization of the plants into the soil, made the soil more habitable for the animals that would come after. And the animals themselves would add to the soil and alter the soil in ways that would make it more hospitable for other animals to come in and find homes and live in the burrows and exploit the improved flow of air and water and everything else. All of the participants in this grand ecological procession eat from the soil or from the fruits that grow from it, and they all return their biomass back to the soil throughout life, and finally in death. In this way, the soil represents a great reservoir of biological resources and chemical energy. It plays a critical part in the circle of life. Okay, now that was a pretty cool introduction to soil evolution, but I want to pause for a second and shift gears. Let's look closer at the geological and physical details behind soil formation to get a more in-depth and technical understanding of this unique biome. Before we get too far into this topic, let me clarify something. I need to emphasize that the soil biome is extremely complex, to the point that classifying soils into distinct types is very challenging. The formation of soil is not nearly as neat and clean and straightforward as a pure, controlled chemical reaction performed in a lab, and because there's literally millions of variables and ingredients in the soil that create unique chemical environments and microclimates. This is really important to understand when you're trying to understand soils. In fact, there is no universally agreed upon system of classification for soils, as there's extensive technical disagreements about how things should be defined, and what counts as this or that, what geological processes created the materials, etc. So, to keep things simple, when I mention certain types of soils throughout this episode, I'll try to stick to the soil taxonomy that's used by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA taxonomy is mostly similar to other soil databases, like the World Reference Base for Soil Resources, or taxonomies used by other nation-states with relatively unique soil environments, like Australia or Russia. But there's just some technical details that are different, and different names are used for similar soils and so on, and I just wanted to clarify for you where I'm getting my terms and definitions that I'm going to use here in this podcast. With that being said, now let's take a look at the technical details of how soil is formed and get a glimpse at the many different types of soils there are. First things first, we have the parent material. This is any kind of bedrock or base material from which mineral particles are initially generated through erosion or various biological processes. This is any kind of bedrock or base material from which mineral particles are initially generated through erosion and various biological processes. Parent material can include substances like the silicate mineral quartz, the calcium and carbon-containing mineral calcite, the aluminum-containing mineral feldspar, and the molecularly complex biotite mineral mica. Physical processes work on these rocks to fragment and erode them, creating some quantity of smaller particles, and these particles generally share the same chemical properties as their parent material. However, do take note that the new shape, texture, and size of these eroded mineral particles can create new mechanical properties, not chemical properties, but new mechanical properties. From a chemical perspective, rocks can be eroded by water and waterborne compounds, and the minerals converted into more soluble forms. For example, carbonic acid in water can react with calcite to turn it into calcium bicarbonate, which is highly soluble and will wash away in the rain. This is a really good example of how minerals can be displaced and moved physically or geographically through the movement of water. Another interesting process is when water reacts with ionic salts, breaking the salts apart and washing them out. Other chemical processes of rock weathering include oxidation, where oxygen molecules are added, and reduction, where oxygen molecules are removed. Both types of oxidative weathering induce stresses on the crystal structure and make the rock more vulnerable to reactions with water and carbonic acid. From a mechanical perspective, mechanically speaking, water can settle into crevices in the rock, and when winter comes and the water freezes into ice, the expanding ice can force the rock apart, widening fractures. Multiple freeze-thaw cycles, like over the course of millions and millions of winters, can greatly weaken the rock and lead to massive mechanical breakdown. All of these processes, chemical and mechanical, erode rock to various degrees, producing three types of particles grouped by their size. From largest to smallest particle size, these are sands, silts, and clays. These three types of material, sand, silt, and clay, are the fundamental mineral building blocks of all soils. The proportions of these materials in any given soil, in combination with other factors like water and air and local flora and fauna, are very important, and it affects everything about the soil, from its water drainage to its compactability, to its gas exchange capacity, to its physical and chemical stability, to its fertility for life forms. Now, some soils are not very developed. They're not very fertile for life. They're what we call raw soil, which is mostly mineral products with very little, if any, organic content. Perhaps the soil is sulfidic or otherwise toxic in some form. Perhaps it's the banks of a river or a mountain slope where silt and sediment are constantly building up, and no plants ever have a chance to colonize the area. In some places, there may be sparse vegetative cover, but usually it's little more than tiny, fast-growing weed-like plants, as the environment is unsuitable, it's unstable for larger organisms like trees. These undeveloped, mostly raw mineral soils are called entosols, and they cover about 1/6 of the planet's terrestrial surface. Recognizable entosols include much of the sand and gravel-coated expanses of the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Persian highlands, west-central Australia, and scattered regions of southern Africa and North and South America. Closely associated with these entosols are the iridosols. Now, the iridosols are soils that are similar in that they're both very low in organic content. They're not suitable enough to host extensive vegetation, and they're relatively undeveloped, although iridosols show a bit more leaching, a bit more subsurface structure and chemical evolution than the entosols. Now, as you may have guessed from the name, the iridosols are primarily defined by their dryness, their aridity. These soils typically exist in places that are naturally very arid, and they get little to no rainfall. And due to their lack of organic content, they couldn't really retain the water for very long, even if it did rain. This actually has pretty severe ecological consequences. As there's little to no rainfall to leach out minerals, stuff that's deposited by the wind or eroded like various mineral salts, it isn't getting washed away. It builds up in one place. It's static. It's not moving across geographic space. So it builds up, and the soils can salinize. They become heavily concentrated to the point of toxicity with salts. This is really bad for plants, as all of this salt buildup presents a very harmful chemical environment for roots. It stunts plant growth, and it induces the symptoms of metal toxicity. The iridosols are found in conjunction with the entosols in multiple deserts, covering another 1/6 of the Earth's terrestrial surface, including the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, the Saharan and Arabian deserts, the Australian deserts. The iridosols extend into the steppe-land north of the Himalayan mountains, and they exist along the southern tip and the Horn of Africa, and in the Argentinian mountains. Let's return to the three types of mineral particle and what mechanical properties they have. Of the three types, sand, silt, and clays, the sand particles are the largest and the least eroded. Sands don't have much physical consistency, but they can have good water drainage and pretty decent aeration. This can actually be a problem for plants that struggle to grow their roots in soils that are often dry or low in residual water content. If the soil just generally has low water content, and it also has good drainage, so whenever water does come by, it drains out really fast, this is hard on the plants because there's just not enough water that stays in the soil long enough for them to get a good drink and sustain their tissues and their growth and all that stuff. Now, technically speaking, sand is typically a product of eroded quartz, and to a lesser degree, biogenic calcium carbonate, aka eroded mollusk shells and the like, with sand particles being somewhere between 1/16 of a millimeter to about 2 millimeters long, so they're relatively large particles. Now the next category is silt, and silt particles are even smaller than sand, measuring between 1/16 to 1/256 of a millimeter long. Many types of silt that are made up of particles on the lower end of this size range, closer to 1/256 of a millimeter in diameter, these particles tend to be very fine, and they can pack together very tightly. Silts that are made of particles like this retain water better, and they have a bit more structural integrity. These silt particles are very common soil ingredients, forming the core of the very fertile and very common soil type called loess. Loess is mostly made up of smaller, lighter particles that can be carried by the wind. When a bunch of smaller particles are swept up and deposited somewhere as a wind-carried sediment, there's often a buildup of this layer of soft, light, fluffy loess soil. It's very airy, it retains moisture really well, and plants love growing in it. Silt particles on the smaller end of the size spectrum, closer to that 1/256 of a millimeter size, these can be generated by glaciers. As these colossal glacial sheets of ice carve channels down from their mountain wombs, they crush the ground underneath them with their immense weight and their ponderous, unstoppable forward grind. The Earth's surface beneath a glacier is utterly pulverized, and entrapped rocks are destroyed and smashed into a fine powder with 2 to 4 micrometer diameter particles. In fact, this finely ground post-glacial material is referred to as rock flour or rock milk if it's being washed away and dripping off of rocks. And lastly, clays are made up of the smallest particles, with anything smaller than 2 micrometers being classified as a clay particle. As a bulk material that you can hold in your hand, clays are like a sturdy goop, like baking flour after it's been mixed with a little bit of water or milk. This is because the particles are so tiny and so fine-grained that they can be tightly compressed, and this creates sheets or chunks of material that can hold moisture really well, to the point that organisms in clay-heavy soils often struggle with low-oxygen, waterlogged areas in their habitat. There are several clay-based or clay-rich soil types with extreme characteristics. Hardpan soils are those that have been compacted to a very hard, very dense state, such that it's typically completely impermeable to water. Hardpan soils are often rich in clays, which are responsible for its compaction properties, although this comes at a cost of low gas transfer and frequent areas of anoxia, so they're not really that hospitable for life. Ultisols, or red clay soils, also represent an extreme. These are super rich in clay, but they have little to virtually no organic matter, or calcium carbonate materials either. These red clay soils are dense, heavy, very acidic with a pH around 5 or lower, and they typically have very little gas exchange and terrible water drainage. It's very difficult for many plants to grow in these soils, so any agriculture typically requires a lot of fertilizers, intensive irrigation and drainage systems, and the introduction of huge amounts of organic matter by mixing the red clay with a thick layer of manure or something like that. Now, this may be a little counterintuitive, as ultisols are often found in tropical areas like Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the southeastern corner of North America, and areas around the Amazon and Congo rainforest basins. It turns out that for many of these plants that grow in these ultisols in these tropical areas, these plants extend their roots only shallowly into the soil, and they mostly grow through the thicker layers of leaf litter on top of the soil. But on the positive side, clays are very chemically active, as the small size of the particles means there's a very high surface area within the soil. There's lots of places for bacteria to grow, for catalytic reactions to take place, and for water to bind. Perhaps most importantly, clay particles and clay soils are usually negatively charged, which means they attract positively charged ions, or cations. These cations are important for organisms, from microbes and fungi to plants and animals. In other words, clay soils have the right electrochemical properties to effectively retain or hold onto nutrients, like potassium and sodium, so they don't get washed out as easily by rain or river water and mineralized into a state that's generally biologically inaccessible. Naturally, this can make clay-rich soils more fertile in some ways than other soil types. For example, consider the Andesols. The Andesols cover just 1% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, mostly focused around volcanic areas, like mountainous regions bordering either side of the Pacific Ocean. Andesols are created from layers of volcanic ash that have been deposited over an area repeatedly, over and over again, from multiple volcanic eruptions and heavy volcanic activity over who knows how many eons. And as a result, the Andesols are extremely rich in mineral nutrients. They have unique compounds in them, like various types of glass, as well as clay particles made of various colloids that make the soil very chemically active. They're often extremely fertile and support dense, tree-heavy forests and high-yield agricultural crops. Now here's where things get really complicated. For each type of material, sand, silt, or clay, there's a whole bunch of different subtypes, typically based on whatever the parent material is. So for example, I just mentioned a few types of clays, and before that I mentioned sand made of calcium carbonate, like from limestone, and coral and mollusk shells. But there's also the green sands, rich in olivine and glauconite. There's feldspar-rich Arcos sand. There's the dark black sands rich in magnetite, or basalts produced by volcanoes. Silt or clay-rich soils also vary depending on the parent material, and the types and proportions of any other mixed-in substances, like some kind of organic material. As if this wasn't complicated enough, when you mix sand, silt, clay, and organic material in various proportions, you get all kinds of specific materials, each with their own subtypes. And the variety here, the number of combinations you can make, is truly breathtaking. For example, I mentioned loess a few minutes ago. To reiterate, pure silt is a rich and textured substance that is easily moved and it drains well, but it also holds a fair bit of water around the particles. But when the wind blows around lighter, drier upper layers of the soil, and that material settles and builds up with a good portion of sand and a teeny little bit of clay mixed in, it creates loess. This is a very nutrient-rich soil type, which can be particularly fertile and ecologically productive. But unfortunately, loess also erodes easily. If it's not stabilized, it can get washed away in the rain, or blown away in the wind. It can be destroyed in the same way it was created. This is why the presence of fungal mycelia and vascular plants with their root networks are so important for the integrity of the soil. All of the plant's roots, growing as they do through the soil, create a kind of three-dimensional biological net. Primary roots, the thick vascular bundles that branch from the bottom of the stem, provide the core strength. And branching from them are smaller and smaller roots. And from them branch microscopic water-seeking root hairs that perfuse the soil like your vasculature perfuses your tissues. All of these structures, from the scale of single cells to entire forest biomes, helps to consolidate and anchor the soil and prevent it from being blown away in the wind or washed away by rain and flooding. Now this may seem trivial, but it's critically important as it made the world's terrestrial habitats more habitable. It would be extremely difficult to be a burrowing creature who lives in an environment where your home is always vulnerable to natural forces, where a collapsing riverbank or a strong wind can totally rearrange your immediate landscape, destroy your shelter, and disorient you. For that matter, tree-stabilized soils can also help contain rivers, helping protect them from running over their banks and flooding the land. It's much easier to be a fish in the river water or a frog in the riparian zone of the river if the river is a nice, consolidated, and contained body, and not a comparatively shallow sheet churning broadly over the landscape. If it's hard for the smaller, R-selected creatures to get by here, then nothing higher up the food chain is going to have a good time either. Now, if you increase the proportion of clay particles in the soil to about 20 to 30%, you get certain types of loam. In a very broad and general sense, loam is a soil with roughly equal mixes of sand, silt, and clay, although usually with a little less clay. The ratio is usually 40-40-20, or 35-35-30 by weight. And if you tinker with any of these percentages, you can get sandy loam, or silty loam, or clay loam, or other combinations thereof. As a kind of intermediate, middling combination of the three major ingredients of soil, loams tend to have many of their constituents' strengths and fewer of their flaws. For example, loam is an excellent gardening soil because it holds onto nutrients and water, but not so much that the soil can't drain properly. The general nutrient level is thus pretty high, making it richer than most other soils and more resistant to washout. A key ingredient in loam, critical to its ability to retain moisture and nutrients, is its soil organic matter, or its SOM, and a major component of the SOM is humus. Okay, so I'm introducing a lot of stuff here, but let's slow down and define our terms and get some context. Okay, so what's the soil organic matter, the SOM? And what's humus? Well, generally speaking, soil organic matter is any kind of biological substance in the soil. It includes any kind of biological detritus at all stages of decomposition, as well as all of the organisms that are alive and well, that are living in the soil. This includes microbes, fungi, plants, microfauna and microflora, and all of the organic chemicals they produce, the stuff they secrete and exude or otherwise release into the soil environment. SOM is a term that encompasses a lot, literally all the organic matter in the soil. In terms of total mass, the SOM is usually between 1 and 6% for typical soils. And that might seem like it's not a lot, but keep in mind this is in terms of total mass, and we're comparing it with minerals, stuff that's made of elements that tend to be a lot larger and heavier than carbon and nitrogen and oxygen. Stuff like potassium and magnesium and iron. Within the SOM, the majority of the biomass, about 70 to 75% of it, comes from microorganisms like microfauna and bacteria. Another 20 to 22% or so comes from macrofauna, or larger animals that can be seen with the naked eye. And this includes not just their bodies, like earthworms and beetles squirming around in the soil, but all of the waste products that they create too, including stuff like shed exoskeletons, discarded shells, hair and various cutaneous pieces, as well as feces. The remaining 5 to 10% of the soil organic matter is plant roots, from small rhizoids and thin root networks to the great root systems of forests. According to an almost 30-year-old study on erosion and soil conservation, an acre of soil may contain several tons of soil organic matter, including approximately 130 to 140 pounds of protozoans, 900 pounds of earthworms, almost 900 pounds of arthropods, 1,500 pounds of bacteria, and over 2,400 pounds of fungi. Being generous with our rounding here, that comes out to about 3 tons, or about 6,000 pounds of biomass in a given acre of typical soil. Naturally, just like with sands, silts, and clays, there are different types of consolidated organic matter too, based on the organisms that produced it. One of those types is humus. And of course, humus has its own varieties and subtypes, but generally speaking, humus is dark, rich, moist soil, uniform and spongy in texture, formed from the degraded biomass of mostly plants. Okay, now I'm going to go on one hell of a tangent here, but pay attention. It's going to get a little out there, but I promise you, we'll come back around and tie it all in, and it'll all make sense. So the formation of humus begins with plant litter, which includes leaf litter as well as all the other fresh plant tissues dropped to the ground, like needles, flowers, fruits, as well as woody parts like twigs, branches, bark, and entire trunks that fall and become logs. Here, the plant litter creates a loose overlayer to the soil, which is really good at retaining water that then drains into the soil below. Rain will come down and hit the leaf litter, and this is also, as a quick aside, the rain coming down can erode the soil, but if there's this overlayer of leaf litter, the rain will hit these decaying leaves and stuff that'll absorb a lot of the mechanical impact, the force, and the soil underneath is relatively undisturbed, and so this can contribute to soil stability. Anyway, rain comes down, it hits the leaf litter, and then it slowly drains below. It drains through the leaf litter into the shadowy area underneath. And in this shadowy area, beneath the leaf litter overlayer, evaporation is impeded, and the water, instead of evaporating away back into the air, will drain into the soil. Leaf litter also provides cover for animals like salamanders, millipedes, and worms. Under the leaves, it's dark and moist. This unique microclimate allows many such creatures to thrive, as well as fungi and even some plants, who take advantage of the soft, loose nature of the leaf litter to easily spread out their roots or their rhizomes. The leaf litter will be degraded and recycled through several more or less simultaneous processes. Herbivores and herbivorous detrivores, like millipedes and woodlice, will begin to mechanically break down the plant tissue by chewing and ripping at it with their mouthparts. The plant tissue that they eat is then digested, it's chemically processed, and excreted as waste, which returns carbon, nitrogenous compounds, and mineral nutrients like phosphorus back into the soil. But these herbivores can't destroy all of the plant tissue. They merely break a small portion of it up into smaller pieces. But this allows bacteria and fungi and other microscopic decomposers like nematodes and various protozoa to thrive. Exploiting the large surface area of shredded leaf litter debris, these smaller organisms invade the broken plant tissue, mechanically and chemically degrading it at a molecular scale. The first compounds to go are small proteins, as well as simple sugars and starches, which are relatively easy to metabolize. These types of molecules yield both raw carbon for the construction of other biomolecules, and chemical energy that can be harvested and used to power, well, pretty much everything else. Larger proteins will last a bit longer, but they're also usually degraded pretty quickly in these early stages of decomposition. And both large and small proteins yield carbon, as well as oxygen, precious nitrogen, and nutrients like phosphorus, sulfur, and even iron and copper. The next important chemicals to be degraded, which typically take a fair bit more time and effort than the sugars and the proteins, are the various types of celluloses. The basic cellulose is a single-stranded polymer composed of repeating dimers of D-glucose. There's also hemicelluloses, which are more chemically diverse. They have complex, fluffy, branching polymer structures that include a wider diversity of sugars, like xylose or mannose, among several others. These celluloses are robust chains of sugars that make up most of the cell wall in most cells in basically every green plant in the world. These celluloses are sturdy chemicals, harder to break apart, especially when they're stacked in layers like they are in plant cells. But it can be done. Termites, for example, can digest cellulose, as their gut microbiome contains several species of microbe that can chemically degrade and metabolize these green plant structural polymers. They're broken down into smaller, simpler components, often having been altered in several ways by the various chemical pathways inside of the organisms that ate them. Finally, a type of molecule called lignin is the largest and most complex type of polymer, and it takes the longest amount of time to degrade. This lignin is a huge molecular structure that's packed with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It contains a lot of chemical energy, but it's really difficult for microbes to penetrate the structure and tap into that chemical energy. But there are those who can do it. Most famous among them are the select few species of white rot fungi, among other fungi, that typically use a variety of peroxidases to disrupt the oxygen bonds and punch holes through the lignin. This process creates a fair bit of chemical debris, or altered byproduct molecules, like various phenols, which are molecules that contain at least one carbon ring. And a lot of these altered byproduct molecules, this chemical debris, is handled and further degraded by more peroxidases and copper-rich phenol-oxidizing lactases. Now, you might have noticed that there's a lot of byproducts being created during all of these various metabolic processes to extract nutrients and chemical energy. A lot of these byproducts are altered or randomly beat up by various enzymes along the way, and after a while, they come to a rest at the end of some chemical pathway where there isn't much more that can be done with them, at least metabolically, by some microbial organism. These kind of end-stage, end-chemical pathway compounds include all kinds of deformed lignins, as well as long-chain lipid derivatives like various waxes, oils, and fats. These chemicals don't react with much, but they can often react with each other to create new compounds that revitalize the soil with fresh, bioaccessible chemicals. Now, in all of this rotting plant matter, a lot of nutrients are leaching into the soil, like sulfur and phosphorus. When these compounds leach out, they become free inorganic ions or substances in a process called mineralization. When these chemical derivative end products react with each other to create new chemicals and propagate along refreshed chemical pathways, they can prevent some of these nutrients from leaching and mineralizing into the soil by keeping them in an organic form. So to put it another way, this leaching, this mineralization, is the removal of these particles from an organic substrate, like decaying plant matter, and their introduction to the inorganic components of the soil. Products of these terminal pathways include a large number of acids, including a variety of humic acids and fulvic acids, fatty acids and amino acids, dicarboxylic acids and phenolic acids, and so on and so forth. Some of these compounds, like fulvic acids, are very soluble, but others are somewhat less soluble. Fatty acids and humic acids, for example, will coagulate or clump together, and amino acids can form peptide chains that fold together. These larger compounds, or these larger masses of compounds, are easier to precipitate, but many are still somewhat soluble and can be moved around by rain and rivers. Now, even though we have all of this residual chemical activity in the leaf litter, as plant tissue is broken down and degraded into nutrient-rich mush that composes and reinvigorates the soil, and fresh chemicals are produced anew, even then, it can all only go so far. A molecule, at some point in some chemical pathway, may be absorbed by a plant or a fungus. These organisms will then metabolize it and reintegrate it into biomass, and on it goes into the next stage of the cycle. It keeps getting recycled in that sense. But other times, in most cases actually, this mishmash of melting vegetable chemistry produces terminal products like humans. That's humans spelled H-U-M-I-N-S, not humans, H-U-M-A-N-S. These humans, spelled H-U-M-I-N-S, are very large, they're very complex, and very diverse chemical compounds. They're basically enormous molecular structures that branch wildly, containing the products of countless reactions that have occurred in the soil, like some kind of chemical playground or free space where anyone can draw something or make an addition. Here's a metaphor. Imagine the International Space Station. Now imagine that it's not going to be abandoned and crashed into the sea, but instead it's going to be renovated, repopulated, built up and moved into a higher orbit so it can have a longer lifespan. New sections are added, and new groups join the crew. The station grows, its structure extending and branching out in all directions as new modules are added, new contraptions, new equipment, new tools, new connections. It has to be pushed out into a higher orbit due to its sheer size and mass. Imagine all of this construction and addition on the International Space Station going on for centuries without disruption, until, eventually, the station is a colossal three-dimensional maze of modules, tubes, chambers, capsules, engines, solar arrays, and all sorts of stuff. This is kind of what individual human molecules are like in the soil. They're vast and highly varied conglomerations of a bajillion soil-based chemical reactions. Remember how I said I'd bring this tangent back around? How I said I'd tie this all back in? Well, here we go. All of these substances, from the original heavily degraded plant matter to the humic and fulvic acids to the monstrous human molecules, all of these substances are what compose the humus. This is how humus is formed. This is what it's made of. And this is why it's such an incredibly fertile type of soil, not just for plants, but for all kinds of life forms. Among its many benefits, humus stabilizes the soil, kind of like how plant roots do, but at a molecular scale, with all of its component branching polymers. It's a tremendously effective way to store carbon in the soil, as these molecules are pretty large, especially the enormous human compounds. Humus also retains water extremely well, staying comfortably moist even in environmental conditions where other soils would have dried out a long time ago. Both of those last two advantages, their ability to store carbon and retain water, also give humus a buffering quality, where it can partially neutralize soil pH that may otherwise be too basic or too acidic. Furthermore, humus binds up minerals and clays extremely well, and the entire soil layer is just packed with nutrients that are stabilized, and they won't wash out or mineralize. All these nutrients can feed a relatively dense community of microbes, which is important because that's the basis of a complex food web. If the lowest levels of the food web are super successful, like they are in humus, this allows for larger and more diverse plant populations and fungal populations, and this in turn allows for larger and more diverse herbivore populations. And if you have a large number and diversity of herbivores, like things going around and grazing on plants, this allows for larger and more diverse predator populations or carnivore populations. In this way, soil nutrition directly influences ecological complexity, and humus is some top-notch stuff that can sustain a super dense, thriving soil-based community. For example, there's a soil type called mollisol. These substrates are typically soft, dark, and nutrient-rich, and great for agriculture. Of course, there's several mollisol subtypes, and one of them is the fantastically rich soil called chernozem, or the more generic black soil. The chernozem has a relatively thick humus layer, composing about 4 to 16% of the soil by weight, which means it's excellent at retaining water. This is really good for the plants that grow here, because chernozem soils typically exist in places with intense dry seasons, like the prairies of Canada and glorious Ukraine. Being able to retain moisture longer during the dry season, at greater depths where plant roots can access it, but the water evaporating to the atmosphere is stifled, is a wonderful trait. Taken all together, chernozem is some of the most fertile, most sought-after soil in the world, to the point that there's even a black market for it. Curiously, at the extreme end, when the humus layer is very overdeveloped, when it's well over a foot thick, and internally, when the humus has more than 15% organic carbon by weight, it can form a histosol. Counterintuitively, these histosol soils are actually really bad for plant growth. they retain way too much water, turning them into anoxic, swampy muck. This constant exposure to water is hugely damaging and can end up draining nutrients and leaching them far away from the surface, even from the otherwise resilient human molecules. And lastly, histosol soils can be way too acidic, to the point that even plants tolerant to low oxygen and low pH may still struggle to grow in them. As you might expect, there's various types of histosol. Most of them are just different types of muck, but if there's a higher fiber content, for example, you get peat, which is a bit more aerated and a bit more ecologically interesting. Nearer to the surface, where the peat is more aerated, it's a soft and porous substrate that's very amenable to small arthropods, worms, burrowing mammals, and of course, amphibians that enjoy the mucky, watery habitat. What's also interesting is that if you can drain some of these histosol soils, if you can get the water out of the muck and turn it into dry soil, that dry soil is actually surprisingly fertile. But there's a catch. Decomposition of leaf litter and dead plants was slowed down by being submerged in water. When the water is drained and the histosol is dried out and aerated, the decomposition process rapidly accelerates, and the land destabilizes somewhat as the subsurface material liquefies and dissolves. There are histosol-like soils in the Arctic called gelisols that are defined by permafrost, and are heavily altered by the freeze-thaw cycles that come with the winter and summer seasons. There's a gelisol subtype called histale soil, which is basically an organic-rich substrate up to 50 centimeters thick, with a permafrost or glacial floor. These are generally more stable soils, albeit not very fertile, as nutrients like calcium and potassium have been leached out. Another gelisol subtype is turbel soil, which is similar to histale soil, except turbels are much more disrupted and torn up by ice lenses, crevices, and expansion-contraction stress from the freeze-thaw cycles. The surface layer vegetation is mostly mosses, lichens, hard grasses, and other sturdy plants, maybe with a few small, scattered fir trees. There's more vegetation, including larger trees and entire forests, in the slightly warmer boreal and subboreal ecosystems, but the soils everywhere up here at these higher latitudes are consistently acidic. This is at least partly due to the decomposition of plant tissues like pine needles, which dry up and drop to the ground, where they cover the forest floor, and as they decay, they release acidic byproducts that substantially lower the soil pH. Throughout the northern latitudes, acidic soils limit the complexity of ecosystems, like the abundance of soil arthropods, or the biomass and diversity of above-ground vegetation, and it can make nutrient uptake difficult for plants that haven't adapted to these soil conditions. Okay, let's change gears again. There's other important topics that we need to cover. I should mention briefly that soils are not just inorganic minerals and organic components. Water is another major soil component, which is rather obvious, I suppose. But so is gas. Up to a quarter of soil volume is empty space filled with various gases, but these soil gases often do not match the chemistry of the planetary atmosphere, with all of its molecular nitrogen and molecular oxygen. Well, I should say that the types of gases are generally similar, but their relative concentrations in the soil are different than they are in the planetary atmosphere. For example, in these confined void spaces in the soil, oxygen is rapidly consumed by plant roots, animals, and microbes, and it's replaced with CO2, carbon dioxide. This replacement of soil oxygen with soil CO2 through various metabolic processes and stuff, this can reach the point that soil CO2 levels can be orders of magnitude higher than atmospheric CO2 levels. Carbonate-heavy soils can bind to this CO2 to maintain a relatively neutral pH, but soils without carbonates to buffer them will see a buildup of CO2 and a drop in the substrate pH. In other words, a buildup of CO2 makes soils more acidic. This is somewhat analogous to the respiration and the blood chemistry of animals. Animals have to engage in regular respiration to bring in more oxygen, but perhaps more importantly, to remove waste CO2, because otherwise that waste CO2 will build up in the blood and lower the blood's pH, making the blood more acidic, and that can have a lot of devastating downstream consequences on the body. In fact, if an animal tries to hold its breath, after a while, when it needs more air, it'll feel the urge to inhale to bring in more air. But the chemical basis of that urge comes not from some detection of low oxygen levels and a compulsion to bring in more oxygen, but rather it's detected by the buildup of CO2 and the acidification of the blood, which encourages the animal body to breathe out, remove that CO2, and subsequently inhale and bring in more oxygen. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but coming back on topic. There are several types of archaea that can generate methane as a product of their metabolism, and these archaea live throughout the soil, as well as in the guts of ruminants, like cows, sheep, and deer. This is why cows and other ruminants burp and fart so much methane. It's all the archaea in their guts breaking down the plant biomass they've chewed up, and because these ruminants generally eat a lot of plant matter, the archaea end up producing a lot of methane. Another really interesting detail is that if oxygen content in the soil gets too low, like in compacted soils where gas flow to the surface is obstructed or blocked completely, anaerobic microbes get emboldened. They spread out and they start tapping new energy sources for their oxygen, like nitrates, which would previously have been preferentially metabolized for their nitrogen. This emboldened use of nitrates for the oxygen they contain instead of the nitrogen will produce product gases like molecular nitrogen and nitrous oxide. And this isn't a good thing, because nitrates are a valuable bioavailable form of nitrogen and oxygen, and these overeager anaerobic microbes are destroying the nitrates and turning them into nitrogen-containing gases that are harder for other organisms to metabolize. In this way, anaerobic soil conditions can lead to reduced or depleted nitrogenous compound levels in the soil, and a buildup of less useful, less bioaccessible nitrogen gases like nitrous oxide and molecular nitrogen. Now, if you happen to be thinking something like, okay, there's a lot of compacted soils and mud out there with lots of low oxygen areas, that must mean that there's a ton of nitrogen gas being produced, and a lot of areas must be low on nitrogenous compounds, right? Well, if that's what you're thinking, then you are exactly correct. Lots of that nitrogen gas filters up into the atmosphere, and wouldn't you know it, our atmosphere is 78% molecular nitrogen. More than 3/4 of all the particles in the atmosphere are molecular nitrogen. Where do you think all this molecular nitrogen comes from? A lot of it comes from anaerobic soil microbes. And for that matter, nitrogen in the soil is often rare enough that it's the limiting nutrient constraining the growth of plant life. It's why artificial fertilizers heavily boost nitrogen, too. As a fascinating aside, have you ever noticed that soil smells different after it rains or when it's been freshly dug up? That smell is more of the gases in the soil, although these are often heavier, volatile organic compounds that don't really make it out of the soil unless it's been physically busted up. When dirt is mechanically disrupted by digging, or when rainwater filters in and displaces those volatiles, those gases, forcing them to move up and leak out into the atmosphere, that's what you're smelling. There's molecular oxygen and molecular nitrogen, there's nitrous oxide, CO2, methane, etc., a lot of these typical soil gases that are being released. But a novel component that you don't smell too often are all of these aromatic compounds, these volatile organic chemicals that evaporate and aerosolize. These include plant root hormones, animal pheromones, fungal exudates, bacterial byproducts, basically all kinds of signaling chemicals that life in the soil has released and that have built up in the soil voids, in the soil gases. Perhaps the most well-known of these heavier organic volatiles is geosmin, an aromatic sesquiterpene compound produced by various filamentous bacteria, blue-green algae, and fungi. geosmin has a distinct earthy odor, and it's a major contributor to that distinctly refreshing smell of the soil after it rains. While we appreciate that aesthetically, geosmin's actual purpose in an ecological and evolutionary context is to ward off microbial predators. It's a chemical signal perceived as an odor or a taste, as is the case with predatory nematodes. These would feed on the soil bacteria, but the bacteria's geosmin chemical signal wards them off. The chemical itself isn't toxic, but it warns the predator that the bacteria who produced it almost certainly is toxic. So in other words, geosmin is this cool aerosolized compound that humans think smells really good. It's really refreshing and it makes the world smell fresh and nice after it rains. But its actual chemical purpose is it's a defense mechanism, a chemical defense mechanism to stop giant nematode predators from gobbling up bacteria. So the reality is just a little bit darker than what humans typically think of. As you can see from these examples, the soil atmosphere is critical to the health and functioning of the larger soil biome. Void spaces in the soil, or empty gaps between larger particles, provide spaces for detrivores to live and move, like the Symphyla and Parapoda, two clades of ancient, blind, pale or semi-translucent myriapods that break down plant detritus, but are themselves too small and weak to move soil around and dig their own burrows. They depend on void spaces in the soil, and tunnels and burrows built by other animals in order to move around. Void spaces allow gases to move and be exchanged with the surface atmosphere, which facilitates the respiration of plant root tissue, fungal mycelia, and of course all of the animals from the microfauna to the macroscopic arthropods, mollusks, and annelids that live in the soil. These animals are highly dependent on relatively looser soils with good aeration, which is why thicker, denser soils, more easily sealed up or waterlogged, like clays or clay-heavy soils, tend to have less habitable subsurface environments for most aerobic organisms. Alright, so let's come back around to erosion. When the bare mineral bedrock has been initially weathered, it creates a layer of what's called saprolite material. Saprolite is a lower-level base layer of the soil that's mostly just the eroded bedrock. Variation in the saprolite layer, like its color, its texture, and chemical composition, is usually due to the various types of minerals from which it was produced, aka the parent material. Heavily eroded bedrock, like what we often see in the tropics, leads to a thick saprolite layer rich in heavy metals like iron. But as this saprolite continues to be weathered by natural forces and colonized by various organisms, it's broken down into even finer particles and mixed with larger and larger quantities of biomass. This biological enrichment of the upper saprolite layer creates the solemn layer, which is also known as the soil biomantle. If the soil contains humus, this is where it would be, in this upper biomantle solemn layer. In essence, this is where a lot of the biologically interesting stuff happens in the soil, and not just microbial activity, gas exchange, and root growth, but more exciting things like bioturbation. That vocab word is pretty self-explanatory. Bio means life, and turbation, in a geological context, means disrupting or mixing the soil. In effect, it's what happens anytime an organism invades or interacts with the soil, moving it around or altering its shape, its density, or its placement in some way. Bioturbation first became a major ecological force when animals evolved the hard parts, like skeletons, necessary to sift through the young, gravelly, fungal-laden protosoils. They dug in to escape predators and to seek food, which they found in ample quantities. After all, the seafloor was coated in bacterial mats and detritus, and as the soil develops, they too were full of detritus from plants and animals alike. These bacterial mats that had dominated for millennia were heavily damaged and disrupted by the emergence of bioturbating animals. Their destruction and the subsequent mixing of the soil made it a more chemically diverse and fertile place for more complex life forms. As animals evolved to specialize in digging or to live in the soil layers, they adopted several strategies. Some species would burrow tunnels through the upper layers, creating corridors or channels that aerated the soil and provided more oxygen to microbes, plant roots, and fungi, as well as the animals themselves, like worms and crabs and everything else. These tunneling animals were unique in how they would consume biomass and soil as they crawled along, only to excrete it sometime later. In effect, they were moving nutrients and mixing the upper soil layers, moving them laterally or with horizontal movement. Perhaps the most famous example of this comes from the annelids, more specifically, the earthworms. These belong to an informal group of animals called ecosystem engineers because their metabolism and their general behavior alters the habitat in really productive and useful ways. The earthworms do this physically by crawling through the dirt and creating small tunnels that aerate the soil and provide pathways for even smaller animals to follow. Some earthworms even form long, narrow passages that descend near vertically into the depths of the soil. If the original earthworm dies or leaves the area, the vertical burrow becomes a microchannel for water, gas flow, and the movement of small soil animals, until, of course, it breaks in, gets unknowingly stomped on by a buffalo, gets filled in with sediment from a rain or a flood or whatever else. A lot of these physical features that you see in the soil as a product of bioturbation, like burrows and tunnels and stuff, a lot of this is very ephemeral. It's very temporary. Many tunnels and burrows could be destroyed by a single flood or a big storm, so a lot of these things are very dynamic. An earthworm's vertical burrow might operate as a channel for water or gas for a little bit, for a short time, until it eventually gets destroyed by the constant churn of natural forces. But there's always more earthworms out there digging more vertical burrows, so there's always more microchannels being created, and of course they're always being destroyed sometime later. But the point is, you get this dynamic flux of ecological contributions from a lot of these ephemeral but constantly being created and constantly being destroyed features, like tunnels and burrows and whatnot. Anyways, the earthworms alter the environment chemically by consuming detritus and smaller organisms like protozoa, nematodes, and fungi. This ingested food often contains a bit of dirt as well, and sometimes the earthworms will just straight up eat dirt, organic material and all. The ingested meal of variable ratios of biomass to dirt is then ground up into a paste as it passes through the earthworm's gizzard. Earthworm gizzards are surprisingly powerful. They can grind down sand into smaller silt and clay-sized particles, and they can reduce small bits of calcium carbonate shell and stones to powder. Further down the digestive tract, the food is chemically digested. Decaying plant tissues, which form the bulk of the earthworm's diet, are broken down with classic amylases and cellulases, but they're also broken down by a unique class of organic chemicals called drylodefensins. These chemicals are dialkylfuran sulfonic acids. They've only been identified in annelid worms, and they're believed to act as surfactants to disrupt plant cells, and as chemical buffers against damaging plant compounds, like the reactive phenols and all of their derivative components that might cause burns or caustic damage to the guts of the earthworm. As a result of this digestion, earthworms mix chelated minerals and broken down organic matter in their guts, and their excrement is thus very rich in nutrients. This microscale breakdown and mixing of the soil, of the leaf litter, is, at an ecological level, an extremely valuable function. Earthworms are among the prime producers of humus, which is basically the end result of billions of earthworms churning through the softer upper soil layers with their horizontal tunneling movements. In contrast, some organisms burrow vertically into the soil to seek food, with their heads pointed down. As they eat, nutrients are passed through their bodies, moving upwards to be deposited at a higher soil layer. Other organisms living a similar lifestyle may be oriented the other way, with their head up. The biomass they consume is thus excreted at lower levels into the soil. Earlier, I mentioned the vertical burrows of earthworms. While many species roam around horizontally near the surface, some species will make permanent vertical burrows, and from this sheltered position, they can venture out into the leaf litter to acquire food, and then retreat back to the safety of the burrow where the food is consumed and digested. The waste products are then excreted either deep in the soil or nearer to the surface, depending of course on how the earthworm was oriented when it entered its burrow. In any case, all of these dietary dynamics are at work constantly, with countless millions of participating organisms in nearly all viable soil types that have sufficient water and organic matter, and aren't too acidic or otherwise inhospitable. At the ecosystem scale, these are really effective mechanisms for soil cycling and physical mixing. Bioturbating animals are critical, for example, to the sulfur cycle and the phosphorus cycle. Soil turnover and the breakup of clumps of dirt gives more surface area for reactions. It opens up these metals to more chemical reactions, whereas before, they may have been deeply embedded in a clump of dirt. This also allows these metals to be washed out in the rain, which is another form of physical movement through the ecosystem. There are various soil-dwelling animals, like ants and termites, that engage in a type of bioturbation called biotransfer, wherein they dig out their massive tunnel colony complex by taking small bits of dirt and moving it somewhere else. Some termite species, for example, build their colonies in the form of large, tall, cylindrical mounds. There are some subterranean chambers that dip below the soil surface level, but as the mound is built up, the majority of the internal space, all of the chambers and tunnels and whatnot, are above ground, built within the cylindrical spire of organic enriched soil. On that note, I should mention that this termite processed soil is super fertile. All of the termites' waste and the decaying bodies of their dead have enriched the soil with nutrients and allow it to hold onto water really well. In areas where termites have been building mounds for millions of years, where countless termite mounds have been built up, abandoned, eroded, destroyed, and the material dispersed back into the environment, the local soils are particularly fertile, and they tend to host unusually dense pockets of vegetation. A similar phenomenon can be seen with isopods, which are a group of crustaceans that include the woodlice. Now, the isopods don't move dirt around to create giant mounds like the termites do, but what they do is they eat plant detritus, or decaying vegetable matter, and in the course of digestion, all of this chemically processed plant biomass gets compacted and excreted in the form of dense little pellets. These pellets are more nutrient-rich than the surrounding soil substrate, and this attracts bacteria and fungi to colonize the pellet and metabolize those nutrients. The addition of these microbes and their processing of mineral nutrients into more biologically accessible forms only makes the isopod fecal pellets more nutritious for other organisms. In fact, the isopods themselves may return and eat their own enriched pellets, with all the bacteria and fungi and all, and this has led some researchers to identify this whole process as symbiotic between the isopods and the pellet-invading microbes, even describing the pellets as a kind of external rumen. Or in other words, the isopod eats all of this plant detritus, digests it as much as it can, and then excretes these dense, nutrient-rich pellets. The pellets get invaded by microbes, the microbes help break it down a little bit more, make some of those nutrients a little more accessible, they add nutrients of their own, they're bringing their own biomass to the table, or to the pellet, and then the isopod comes back and eats it, and upon digestion can extract a little bit more nutrients. The stuff the microbes helped free up and make a bit more bioaccessible, and nutrients from the microbes themselves. In effect, it's an external rumen. The ants, in contrast to the termites, will dig out a complex series of chambers near the surface, with vertical tunnels spiraling downwards. Chambers branching laterally off of these vertical tunnels become less and less frequent the farther down they are, such that the entire colony takes on the form of a fluffy jellyfish buried in the soil. All of the soil that's excavated during the process of digging out this colony gets deposited, and it builds up around the entrance of the colony, creating the classic anthill formation. As the soil has been removed from deep under the surface, the ants are responsible for a kind of biotransfer-based inversion of soil material. They bring stuff up from deeper layers and deposit it on higher upper layers. Although I should point out that this inversion is not nearly as thorough or as wide-ranging as more physical inversion processes, like the cryoturbation that you see near areas of permafrost and ice lensing. And of course, what's a conversation about bioturbation without a mention of larger animals, like the vertebrates? These bigger macroscopic fauna also mix the soil, but in a much more aggressive fashion. Animals that burrow, either to build dens, bury food, or lay their eggs, will disrupt the surface with their digging. Subsurface soil is brought up to the top and spread around. Soil gases are released. The topography is altered, and the dig spot is more apt to retain water or wind-blown leaves and dust. All kinds of animals do stuff like this, from rutting ungulates scraping their hooves along the ground, to hogs and boars digging around for truffles and tubers, to gophers, crabs, ground-nesting birds, non-arboreal reptiles, moles, voles, and everything else that makes basin-like nests, or pocket-like burrows, or entire tunnel networks in the soil. Whatever form it takes, when an animal's burrow is abandoned, it can collapse and disrupt the soil layers. It can be a water channel that improves the local hydrology for a brief time before filling up with sediment. All of these processes alter the soil topography and biogeochemistry. Now, so far in the show, I've mostly talked about smaller creatures, like ants and isopods and earthworms. So let me give you an example with larger creatures, with megafauna. Consider the seasonal migrations of ungulates moving in great herds across the rolling plains and forests of Africa. Now, the first thing to understand is that these migrations aren't a single discrete circuit or loop out there somewhere. Across all of Africa, you have this rugged tapestry made up of thousands of threads, each thread representing a large herd of ungulates moving on their own in some region at some time of year. These migrations take place across the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa, but the most famous migration is in Kenya and Tanzania. Here, many hundreds of thousands of animals will perform a great annual circuit throughout the northern hinterlands of Tanzania and the southern reaches of Kenya. Now, this particular region lies almost directly on the equator, so there isn't a seasonal difference in daylight and temperature, as one would see at higher latitudes. Rather, there's patterns of rainfall and drought. The animals follow the rain and avoid areas in drought. At the start of the year, many animal herds will congregate in northern Tanzania along the sloping landscape south and southeast of Lake Victoria, which includes the famous Ngorongoro Conservation Area. This is an incredible time of year, where many different species come together. 250,000 zebra will come and graze on the water-fattened grasses, followed by almost 2 million wildebeest, 500,000 gazelle, and hundreds of thousands of other creatures, like giraffe, antelope, buffalo, and elephant. The enormous numbers involved in these migrations are only possible because the animal species tend to eat different kinds of plants, or different parts of the same plant. So even though they're moving through the same general areas, they can keep food competition to a minimum. For example, some species eat grasses. Zebras prefer taller grasses, while wildebeest prefer shorter, stockier grasses. The very small dik-dik gazelles eat the leaves from small shrubs and the lowest branches of trees. But larger gazelle species and impalas tend to eat leaves from the middle branches of trees, and the charismatic giraffe eat from the tallest branches. On that note, It's quite likely that the giraffe's neck is the evolutionary product of this dietary sectarianism, which itself would have been a product of the evolutionary pressure against competition. In essence, if you have all of these animals in the same area, eating the same kinds of foods, competition is going to encourage them to eat different foods in the area. Or if they eat from the same plant, they may eat different parts of the plant, or from different areas on the plant, as this will make it a bit easier for everyone to get something to eat. In order to do this, to develop dietary sectarianism that'll reduce competition, these species will develop adaptations to fit better into their particular niche, or to better eat whatever their particular food source happens to be. Ergo, we have giraffes developing long necks to give them exclusive access to the leaves at the upper branches on the trees. If the giraffes, owing to their long necks, are the only ones eating the leaves at the top of the trees, they're the only ones tapping this particular food source, then their competition with other species is basically zero. The only food competition they would experience is against other giraffe. Anyway, this time spent in Ngorongoro at the beginning of the year is also a birthing season, and many new calves born here will need to be raised up and strengthened before the spring migrations. The wildebeest, for example, are known to give birth to about 500,000 calves in a 2 to 3 week time window in the middle of February. The timing of this great birthing event is really important. There's always predators lingering at the edges of these herds, lingering in the wake of these migrations, scoping out injured wildebeest or sick gazelle or the like. The young and the old are also prime targets. Animals born too early, for example, say they're born in January, may stand out as the youngest and the smallest compared to the adults and the bigger surviving youth that were born last year. Until the great bulk of calves are born, these early babies, these early calves, they won't have the advantage of a large herd of similar sized, similar colored calves to blend into. They stand out more, and predators are more likely to see them and track them. And on the other side of the spectrum, animals that are born too late may be too weak to keep up when the herds start moving. They may trail behind, or have difficulty staying in a group, and this too will make them more vulnerable to predation. By the month of May, the rains in Ngorongoro start to dry up, and the animal herds move out for greener fields. They move northwest and linger in the Grumeti Game Reserve, a classic dryland Serengeti corridor adjacent to the Grumeti River. Here, the rainwater swells the rivers and feeds the soil. The plants grow rapidly, and the herds arrive to eat them until June, when the rains move elsewhere and the landscape begins to dry up. This downtime in the Grumeti area is characterized by widespread mating. It's mating season, basically, and this is when the calves born next February are conceived. At the end of June, the herd animals face a difficult challenge. By July, the rainfall has moved north, across the border into Kenya. To follow, the animal herds must travel through the Serenera and Morukopji's corridors, and cross the Grumeti and Mara rivers. The recent rains moving through the area have swollen the rivers, making it dangerous to cross at certain points where the current is too fast or too rugged. To make matters worse, these rivers and wetlands are populated by crocodiles. And like brown bears hunting salmon during their Piscian mating season, the crocodiles are also well aware of the animal migrations and eagerly await their annual feast. To be fair, the migrating animals also know the dangers of the river as well, including the crocs. When a group of ungulates approaches the riverbanks, their behavior can follow a certain pattern. The group may be tentative at first, walking up to the riverbank, but not immediately entering. They scope it out, trying to spot any crocodiles hiding in the murky water. Some of them may dip their head down to get a closer look, or to take some anxious drinks of water. Pressure begins to build up as more animals arrive, pushing those in front of them. Eventually, whether they lose their footing, lose their patience, or build up their courage, a few solitary individuals at the water's edge may leap into the river and attempt to sprint across. This opens up the proverbial floodgates, as the rest of the herd follows in a thundering stampede. The water is churned white with stamping hooves, and moments later, the snapping of reptilian jaws and the smashing of long, scale-covered tails. The herbivores may try to group up tightly and move across the river in groups. This protects the bulk of them in the middle, but those on the edges are still vulnerable to the jaws of a crocodile. This also harkens back to the importance of the timing of the calving season, as calves born too late may be too small to safely cross the Mara River. In many cases, calves have been observed to wade into the water and stand on their own feet for mere seconds before being attacked and pulled under the surface by a crocodile. The old, the young, the weak, the sick, and the infirm are already struggling against the flow of river water. The crocodiles are their doom. It's no exaggeration to say that blood fills the water and stains the shorelines red. Even strong and healthy ungulates can die in these rivers. Wading into the water, they walk blindly over obscured terrain, and they can easily slip on an unexpected slope or twist in the riverbed. And that's all it takes for a crocodile to launch an opportunistic attack, snapping down on a neck or a nose, a foot or a thigh, and crushing down with a force of up to 3,700 pounds per square inch. Having captured their prey, the crocs will violently shake them around or perform a death roll, which usually mangles and disembowels them or tears off the limb. The entire river crossing event is a spectacularly gory festival of carnivorous indulgence. Those migrating animals that survive the river crossings will make it to an area in Kenya now protected as the Masai Mara National Nature Reserve. The herbivores will stay here, feasting and grazing until November, when they follow the rains south. This southward excursion is the longest leg of the journey, and it sees the herds moving back down to the Ngorongoro area just as the storms and intense rains are calming down, and the shrubs and tall grasses are at their peak growth. Now, from the perspective of the weather, it might seem like the ungulates are responding to ecological forces. And that's true, they are following the rain. But they're also an ecological force unto themselves, drastically altering the landscape and the soil beneath their hooves. Just imagine the level of bioturbation created by millions of mammals, many of them weighing hundreds of kilograms, and many of them equipped with sharp hooves, charging over the same strip or corridor of land. The landscape, the surface soil, gets absolutely shredded. The animals are also pooping, and giant migrating animal herds like this will leave behind an immense layer of feces that gets ground into the soil. Consider an individual in the middle of a herd, or in the middle of a long line of others walking along a stamped-out path. If this animal in the middle of the group were to poop, its excrement would land on soil that's been tilled and torn up by the hooves of those in front of those animals that came before it. And those animals coming behind will stomp on its feces and grind it up and mix it into the soil. When it's not just one individual animal pooping, but hundreds of thousands of animals pooping and hundreds and thousands of animals stomping up the ground and stomping up the poop, this whole phenomena means the soil gets heavily fertilized every year. So, in a way, the animals are contributing to their own food production. They're contributing to the fertilization of the soil that will grow their food next year. There's also lots of death, and not just from predators. Many of the migrating herbivores will die from exhaustion on the long journey. Some of them will die from deprivation. They may be unlucky enough to go through a particularly hot and dry area with little vegetation to sustain them. Or, if they're near the back of their main herd, they run the risk of every watering hole they get to having already been drunk dry and stomped to ruins, and every grassy field stripped bare and polluted with poop. Those weary animals that die of exhaustion, or thirst, or hunger collapse onto the ground and decay quickly in the humidity and sweltering heat, aided by scavengers like flies and vultures. The rapid breakdown of these corpses returns more nutrients to the soil. And of course, the living animals are further stressed by the presence of predators. Those herbivores traveling along the Serengeti are being hunted by hundreds of lions, hundreds of leopards, and thousands of spotted hyenas, as well as smaller numbers of cheetahs, and even smaller numbers of African wild dogs. There are similar migrations taking place all over sub-Saharan Africa, including enormous wildebeest migrations that see them move from South Africa to the Congo Basin. The African wild dogs are common predators across much of the continent, but curiously, not so much in the Serengeti in Tanzania and Kenya. Here, local populations of lions and hyenas have destroyed the wild dog populations by hunting them and stealing their kills. They've applied so much ecological pressure that wild dog populations just can't live here. They can't coexist with this density of lions and hyenas. And this density of lions and hyenas is only possible because of the extreme density of these migrating herbivores. Altogether, these migrations represent a vast wave of biomass and biochemical energy surging across the landscape, from the post-rain explosion in plant growth to the enormous groups of herbivores moving through to the many smaller groups of predators chasing after them. This whole phenomena is a powerful mover of nutrients across the landscape, deeply enriching the soils and helping propagate next year's plant growth. Similar ecological patterns can be seen in migrations around the world, even from birds who don't usually migrate by walking on the ground. Migrating birds can inadvertently carry plant seeds that get stuck in their feathers, or that they've eaten but didn't destroy and aren't destroyed by their digestive system and survive in their poop. This means that migrating birds play a really important role in helping plants colonize new areas. And of course, the birds also poop a lot, and their waste is rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. In fact, seabirds are often critical pioneer species, as they visit undeveloped islands to rest and take breaks from flying and hunting fish, and the areas where they rest or where they make nests are usually coated in thick layers of nutrient-rich poop. This stuff gets eroded and washed in the rain, its particles get slathered on and mixed into nearby island regolith, and it quickly creates very fertile clumps of organic-rich soil that can be exploited by the first generations of plants to settle the island. Now, plants can also engage in bioturbation, but not nearly to the same extent or at the same speed as animals. For example, when a tree grows over the course of centuries, its root system expands substantially and spreads throughout a large volume of soil. The roots mechanically push soil apart as they grow, and they bind soil as their root networks get established. Some plants spread their roots widely, but at a relatively shallow depth in the ground. Other plants spread their roots barely beyond the perimeter of their shoots, of their canopy, but they penetrate deep into the soil, often reaching the water table where they can pull up moisture and help keep the upper soil layers wet, even in otherwise dry weather conditions. When a tree dies, its roots will decay and rot away. This enriches the soil, and at first, it'll create a network of softening, rotting plant tissue that can be gobbled up by all sorts of soil-dwelling invertebrates, like earthworms and microbes and stuff. After the soft, rotting root tissue has been largely consumed, this can leave tunnel-like voids behind. And these void spaces, these root-created tunnels, they can collapse, or they can serve as pre-made tunnels for other animals, or they can fill up with water or sediment. In other cases, the roots may not be destroyed, but trees may fall over, and their roots may be ripped out of the ground, bringing with them large clumps of dirt, basically inverting a huge scoop of material and letting it break apart and melt in the rain and mix in with the surrounding soil over the following decades and centuries. Plant root systems can also chemically alter the soil as they grow and interact with fungi and herbivorous microfauna. The primary chemical way that plant root systems do this is through root exudates. Now, root exudates is a very broad term encompassing a huge variety of different substances. Sometimes they're released in response to environmental stressors, while other times they're released as a natural part of the plant's life cycle or growth process. Depending on the species of plant and its age or stage of development, the exudates can include everything from simple ions to more complex molecules like amino acids and sterols. Some of these chemicals encourage fungi to form symbioses with the roots, acting kind of like an interspecies messenger molecule or a powerful attractant. Other chemicals act as signaling molecules to communicate with other root systems to other plants, perhaps warning them of active herbivores nearby, which would elicit an embittering response, wherein the nearby plants release chemicals that makes their leaves bitter and unpalatable to the animals. And yet other root exudate chemicals are defensive in nature and directly repel pathogenic microbes and the small obnoxious herbivores that can damage root hairs, like the symphyllins. More generally, there are exudates that modulate the soil environment by buffering the pH or adjusting the salinity of the soil or the bioavailability of certain nutrients. Many of the exudates the roots release into the environment contain carbon atoms. Carbon, which was once CO2, but extracted and incorporated into sugars through the carbon fixation pathways in photosynthesis. It's estimated that approximately 5% of the sugars produced by a given plant are exuded back into the soil, contributing to the biome by feeding mutualistic microbes and fungi, and making the soil environment generally more tolerable for the roots and the rhizomes of other plants. All of these animals I've mentioned, and all the plants and fungi and microbes, they all play a part in the ecology and food web of the soil habitat. Let's examine the soil habitat food web in closer detail, and examine each level of the trophic chain and how it affects the soil environment. At the base of this food chain are the primary producers, or, to put it simply, the plants. These are primary producers because they convert raw resources into biomatter. They use the power in sunlight to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, and they react it with water to produce sugars and oxygen gas. These land plants have thoroughly colonized the soil biome. Their roots permeate the organic-rich layers in search of water and nutrients. Their roots mechanically stabilize, and their root exudates buffer the soil environment. And all the leaf litter and detritus from the perpetual growth, senescence, and death of all of these plants deposits biomass onto the upper layers of the soil, which are then broken down and recycled. This recycling is primarily accomplished by the bacteria and archaea that coat everything. Living plants, dead plants, clumps of soil inside and out, on rocks, in rocks, sand, silt, in clay complexes, in animal feces, in shed hair or shells or exoskeletons, in rotting animal corpses, everywhere. These microbes break down biomass at a chemical level, thoroughly degrading rotting plants or decaying corpses or the dried-up protein-rich husks of their fellow microbes. They represent a colossal portion of the soil biomass, and they help recycle huge quantities of detritus, so it's pretty clear that they play a fundamental and irreplaceable role in the carbon and nitrogen cycles, as well as the cycling of many other mineral nutrients. The metabolic byproducts of all of this decomposition includes gases like CO2 and methane, and a wide variety of metabolites that can alter the soil chemistry. For example, upper soil layers include algae, photosynthetic microbes that make a massive contribution to global rates of oxygen production and carbon fixation. These microbes, mostly the bacteria, can also be killed by viruses. Viruses are everywhere in the soil, and many of them exhibit bacteriophage-like behavior. They can infect bacteria and destroy them, causing their single-cell bodies to rupture and their innards to spill out into the environment. In this way, viruses are an important down-regulator of bacterial populations, and their metabolism, their destruction of bacteria and other microbes, is a prominent source of dissolved organic carbon. In other words, all of the bacterial cells that these viruses kill then go on to enrich the soil with carbon, as well as nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. Alongside the microbes, you have fungi, whose hyphae also explore and tap the environment at a cellular level. Fungal spores, hyphal fragments, and growing mycelia saturate most soils, creating a fungal coating that's largely invisible to our eyes, but has huge effects on the soil habitat. To paraphrase what we've already discussed about fungi, they're effective at breaking down rocks through chelating chemical reactions and mechanical degradation. Their mycelia offers a bit of structural integrity to the soil, albeit not nearly as much as plant roots do. They're excellent at extracting water and mineral nutrients, and through their symbioses with plant root systems, they can share their water and nutrient bounty with their green-leafed friends and boost the health and vitality of the entire ecosystem. And in their turn, both bacteria and fungal hyphae are preyed upon by larger protozoa. These protozoans are single-celled eukaryotes, like amoeba, flagellates, and ciliates. These free-living, mobile, heterotrophic microbes prey upon smaller, weaker, less mobile bacteria. They chase them down and engulf them in cytoplasm, phagocytizing them and breaking them down and metabolizing them into more bioaccessible formats. The protozoa are more effective in moist soils, where an aqueous solution lets them move more efficiently, and where there are higher concentrations of bacteria and fungi. On that note, filamentous fungi, like hyphae, are easy food for protozoa. They attach themselves to the stalk or the stem and simply chew through the single cell and suck out its innards. The rest of the broken hyphae can then be consumed, much like you'd eat a protein bar. And the protozoa, in their turn, are preyed upon by nematodes, as well as larger invertebrates like earthworms and other annelids, and all manner of soil-dwelling arthropods. Nematodes in particular are really important to the soil food web and soil ecology. Not only do nematodes prey upon bacteria and fungi, they also feed directly on the primary producers, on the plants, on their roots and root hairs. And there are predatory nematodes that are big, beefy killers of protozoans and smaller nematodes. In this way, the nematodes play a critical role in connecting the micro and macroscopic organisms in the food web. All of these organisms, from bacteria and fungi to protozoa and nematodes, all of them are food for tiny arthropods like mites, crabs, and symphylans. Many of these creatures are too small to dig their own burrows, so instead they maneuver through void spaces in the soil, where they use the burrows and tunnels built by other animals. They crawl over and around the clumps of soil, seeking out fungal filaments to chew on, or juicy nematodes and fat protozoans to gobble up. Many of these types of creatures, particularly the symphylans and the pauropods, are mostly or entirely herbivorous. They're not hunting down protozoans or nematodes, they're munching on fungal mycelia, or algae, or the fine root hairs projecting off of the larger plant roots. In any case, what we have here is a complex community of organisms, ranging in size from microbes to small arthropods, who break down the plant and animal detritus and recycle those nutrients, incorporating them into larger, more concentrated biological forms that are accessible to even larger, more complex organisms. Microbes use raw chemical processes to break down biomass and incorporate it into their own bodies. Protozoans eat the microbes, nematodes eat the protozoans, and all of these things are eaten by the small arthropods and other squirming invertebrates in the soil. The pattern continues, as smaller arthropods are preyed upon by larger arthropods, like spiders and centipedes. Bigger, tougher plant tissues are mechanically shredded and consumed by larger soil-dwelling herbivores, like millipedes and various gastropods. At this point in the soil food web, when we start getting really juicy macroscopic organisms like earthworms and ants and beetles and stuff, this is when the vertebrates start getting involved, and the food web starts looking a little more familiar. This is also where the food web begins to extend beyond the soil itself. Large bugs and worms are preyed upon by all manner of birds, as well as burrowing rodents, amphibians, and various small reptiles that crawl on the surface, on rocks, on trees, in the tree canopy, and so on. What we're looking at here is a flesh-based trophic pathway by which nutrients are extracted from the soil and incorporated into larger, more complex biological structures. And of course, there are still herbivores that eat the plants, although instead of eating individual algae microbes or chemically burning through some plant detritus, these herbivorous vertebrates are mass feeders. Using their mouth, they ingest large quantities of plant matter and grind it up with their teeth before swallowing it for internal chemical digestion. Herbivorous vertebrates include everything from the very small shrews, voles, ground-nesting birds, and other similar creatures rummaging in the undergrowth, to the very large, the elephants, giraffe, bison, moose, and other charismatic megafauna. All of these smaller and/or herbivorous vertebrates, in their turn, are prey for larger predatory carnivorous vertebrates. For example, snakes tend to prey upon all of those small animals I just mentioned. Birds, rodents, amphibians, small reptiles, these are all fair game for snakes, who slither around on their bellies, over soil and under foliage, to hunt down and surprise attack their prey. Snakes, in their turn, fall prey to large raptors, who can track them and attack them from the sky, and kill them quickly with sharp talons, or from mongooses and honey badgers that can shrug off the snake venom and rip them apart with their bare claws. And then we have all of those examples of bioturbation that I mentioned earlier. Boars digging for truffles, ungulates scraping their hooves on the ground, gophers and prairie dogs and whatnot burrowing into the soil to make chambers and tunnels. But you also have animals like walruses, whose awkward waddling movements and grazing behaviors can stir up the seabed and create clouds of silt and sediment. To hunt for clams, they'll press their sensitive whiskers to the sands on the seafloor and rummage about, scraping up the muck and silt with their tusks. They'll scrape around the sand and try to clear the water with their flippers, and if they discover a mollusk, they'll seal their lips against it, press it into the ground for stability, and forcefully suck out the clam meat with powerful tongue movements. All of this physical activity creates clouds of silt and sediment. It all mixes up the nutrients, it helps dissolve some smaller particles into the water column, and it lets all the precipitating pieces scatter over a wider area. I haven't really talked about aquatic soils at all this episode, because for the most part I wanted to stick to the terrestrial biome, but I also wanted to provide an example that shows how these processes are also at work in marine biomes too. You know what? Why not? Let's take a detour to briefly look at aquatic soils. Generally speaking, you have river and lake bed soils, basically the soils found in freshwater, and then you have marine soils, the stuff that the ocean floor is made of. These are all different, as the soils are formed and altered by their environment in different ways. So let's start with rivers. In a river system, the primary ecological force is the downhill lateral flow of water. The erosive power of this water is immense. Chances are, if you've seen a river, you've seen the many smooth, round rocks that often line the riverbed. These river rocks have been eroded to a smooth finish by the water, and while that leaves cool, round rocks behind, it also means that all of that scraped off material, all of those rock particles that were eroded over who knows how long by the water in the river, they all get carried downstream and deposited on the riverbed or along a riverbank somewhere. It is this flow of eroded mineral particles, such as the type and quantity of parent material, that most greatly influences downstream river soil ecology. Over time, a river may build up layer upon layer of silts and clays brought from parent material eroded further upstream. These alluvial soils can be nutrient-rich, but they're often unstable and undeveloped. In immediate proximity to the river, so right up against the riverbank, it may actually be somewhat difficult for plant life to get established, as the rate of sediment deposition will simply bury any young green plant shoots that try to grow there. A few feet farther away from the river, where the soils are generally more stable because there isn't repetitive, continual deposition of sediment from the river there, we're talking about like 15, 20, 30 feet off the riverbank here, plants can grow very successfully because the soil is often very nutrient rich, and because the river is right there, there's plenty of access to water, all the water that the plants need. When we consider the parent material, you also have to take into consideration how that might affect downstream river and soil ecology as well. For example, on volcanic mountains made of volcanic rock, any rivers that form from, say, ice cap meltwater or glaciers, that water will erode that volcanic rock, and it'll carry the volcanic rock nutrients downstream. This produces riverbanks that are packed with layers of fine-grained, dark-toned volcanic soils. These are typically extremely nutrient-rich, and if they can be extracted, dried a little bit, tempered, and mixed into perhaps some other soil substrate so they can be a bit more stabilized and they can act as a mineral fertilizer, they can be extremely beneficial for plants. Now, this river water loaded with mineral particles can affect other parts of the landscape too. For example, if a river erodes one of its banks, or if it floods and water surges over the edge, it can flood the local area, depositing huge amounts of sediments across an area outside the typical zone of the river itself. This flooding, this river washout, produces entosols, undeveloped but nutrient-rich soils that eventually break down and get mixed in with pre-existing underlying soils. Now, river water can also be deposited into lakes and ponds. This is a pretty interesting phenomenon, as the lake may be a relatively stable ecosystem, but the river can bring new material, which really shakes things up across the lake's food web. The stuff produced by this river-deposited sediment coming into a lake is called lacustrine soil, and it tends to be more clay-like, as the deposited particles are usually very fine. Terrestrial bodies of standing fresh water, or lakes and ponds, are very interesting ecological phenomena. They're isolated bodies of standing water, usually small enough to not have anything like a tide or waves. The erosive power of water is somewhat dulled here, as the water is not flowing as it does in a river. For the most part, the water may appear to be still, and any movement is occurring inside the body of water, under the surface, where it's not immediately visually apparent to anybody just walking by. What I mean is that the movement of water in lakes and ponds tends to be seasonal, temperature-dependent, with water moving in vertically oriented patterns, like the upwelling of warm water and the sinking of cold water. Regarding lake bed soil, it's produced through the accumulation of detritus and small particles. It's a very slow process, and it happens over a very long period of time. Organisms in a lake, like fish and plants, will produce detritus, like feces and loose scales and their decaying dead bodies. All of these things add particles into the water column that eventually precipitate out and settle down to the lake bed. This is a very gradual, very slow process that produces a fine, pasty muck, or an ooze, that lacks structure and has an anoxic subsurface environment, but it may be rich in nutrients. To clarify, the soils formed in this manner, from material settling out of the water column, they're called pelagic sediment. And this is in contrast to terragenous sediment, which is material that flows into the lake or the ocean from a terrestrial source, like a landslide, or wind-blown dust, or sediment from a river. Now, the oceans are a different beast. They're sort of like lakes, in the sense that their soils are generally formed from the accumulation of particles settling out of the water column, and most of those particles are organic or biogenic in nature, but the entire ocean biome is just way bigger. Compared to a lake, everything is scaled way, way up. And this also includes the size and the depth of the seabed soils. The soils of the ocean floor are much more stable and much deeper. They've had much more time to accumulate than the soils at the bottom of a lake. This is just another way of saying that lakes tend to be more ephemeral or short-lived than oceans. Okay, now there's several ways that we could organize marine soils, and slightly different numbers based on which source you're looking at. In a very general sense, ocean soils can be grouped into three major types, and only one of them is primarily composed of inorganic minerals. This particular type, that's primarily composed of inorganic minerals, is red clay soil. It's mostly made up of quartz and fine-grained clays. It has a ruddy brown color, and it covers a collective total of almost 40% of the ocean floor. Sources of this material are primarily terragenous, or land-based, like sediment deposited by a river, erosion and landslides and stuff like that, as well as dust and ash blown into the ocean by the wind. The other two major soil types in the ocean are primarily biogenic, and they're lovingly referred to as oozes. There's calcareous ooze, which covers about half the ocean floor, and siliceous ooze, which is comparatively rare, covering about 15% of the ocean floor. The more common calcareous ooze is a conglomeration of shells of foraminifera, echinoderms, pteropods, coccolithophores, and other small organisms with calcareous shells. The less common siliceous ooze is composed of plankton detritus, and shells that are composed primarily of silica compounds. Mixed in with these two biogenic soil types are particles that come from the surface and are carried in the air and get trapped on the water surface, where they sink and precipitate to the ocean floor. This includes ash from wildfires and volcanoes, as well as dust. In fact, dust from the Sahara Desert is known to get picked up by the wind and carried over the Atlantic Ocean, where it settles broadly over South America. These Saharan sands help fertilize the Amazon rainforest and the nearby ocean water with particles of iron and phosphorus, among other elements. On this note, there's more than just terrestrial dust and volcanic ash that gets caught in the ocean. Most of the meteorites that hit the planet explode in the atmosphere over the ocean. When the solar system passes through clouds of cosmic dust, some of this dust is caught up in the ocean. This meteorite debris and cosmic dust falls to the water. The heavier particles will sink quickly, but the lighter particles may take centuries to reach the ocean floor. This extraterrestrial material is estimated to cover a collective total of 1% of the ocean floor. A common pattern here is that the particles deposited on the seafloor tend to be small. They're clay-sized particles, and the soils formed have many clay-like qualities. For example, the soils tend to be densely packed and uniform. There are few to no larger or coarser particles, and the soil structure itself is undifferentiated. It's unstratified, which is to say, it doesn't have layers. You dig into it, and it's a solid mass of gray-brown clay with terrible drainage and little to no gas flow. Now, there's one animal species who's had an outsized impact on the soil, on its production, on its depletion, on its spread around the world. Like many other animals, the Homo sapien, or the human being, loves food. In its ancient prehistory, the Homo sapien hunted animals for protein, but this was often difficult. Unsuccessful hunts meant the village went hungry. People died. This motivated humanity to seek alternative forms of food production, and in time, agriculture was developed. We learned to turn and till the soil, making it soft and well mixed, and to plant certain seeds at certain depths, and to water them in certain ways, such that they grew tall and provided an ample yield of fruit, flower, leaf, wood, or whatever it was that humanity harvested them for. Now, lots of food could be grown in one place. Humans did not need to move around as much. They could live in fertile, comfortable places year-round with a surplus of food. This innovation revolutionized human existence completely, and as time went on, sophisticated agricultural techniques began to emerge. Crops were selectively bred to produce better yields, and soil was modified and manipulated to be as comfortable as possible for crop-plant root systems. Some soil modifications that humans have developed include improving the water content through irrigation systems and converting harsh landscapes into more hospitable and cultivatable landscapes through practices like terracing. Terracing is extremely popular in Asia, where very steep hillside terrain can be converted into productive farmland. The terraces stabilize the hillside and protect against collapse and landslide. The terraces are filled with water, either from rain or irrigation channels. The prime cultivated crop here is typically rice, and rice plants are special because they can grow even while submerged in water. Meanwhile, many weeds and pests of the rice plant cannot grow while submerged, so the rice is protected. Sometimes fish are even introduced to these water-filled terrace channels as a form of hybrid aquaculture. The fish help mix up the water, they eat insect pests, and their waste and decaying bodies provide nutrients to the terrace soil. Another important technique was the development of anthropogenic soils, or man-made soils. These anthrosols, as they're called, are soils created through long-term manipulation and use by humans, typically in areas where agriculture has been practiced for centuries, and the soil has been tilled and tapped and fertilized and fallowed over and over and over again. Like all the other soil types, anthrosols are highly varied depending on the incorporated materials and their relative proportions. Humans have settled pretty much the entire planet and have at least attempted agriculture pretty much everywhere. In all of this agricultural experimentation, a wide variety of soils have been used, as have an even wider variety of fertilizers, additives, buffers, and composts. Composting is a whole art in and of itself, and the soils you produce through composting vary wildly depending on the ingredients, the time spent composting, the presence of earthworms, pauropods, fungi, and other decomposers, and so on and so forth. For example, throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, up until about the 20th century, when farmers wanted to refresh their fields with a new layer of nutrients, they'd head off to the stables and collect the grasses and straw used for animal bedding. This vegetation was typically harvested the previous year, and after a winter of being repeatedly crushed, warmed, and wetted by a large hoofed mammal, it's in a pretty poor condition. It's very degraded and rotted. Then the sty pits are tapped for manure, and the manure and bedding vegetation get mixed in with water until it created this brown, stinking slurry. This nasty concoction was thrown over the fields to fertilize them. This practice, repeated over and over for centuries, created very deep, very rich, plagan soil. The farm plot itself often grew in elevation, rising up out of the ground as more and more layers were added over the years. Another anthrosol, perhaps one of the most fertile and sought-after types of anthrosols, is known as terra preta, which is Portuguese for black soil. It's a mix of charcoal, ground-up pottery clay, manure and compost, animal bones, and human waste. Terra preta was developed in the Amazon rainforest, which is mostly characterized by a natural soil type called oxisols. Now, oxisol is not a particularly fertile type of soil, which might be a little counterintuitive considering it's the predominant soil type in the Amazon rainforest. Oxisol is iron-rich, often to a level where it interferes with cation exchange and nutrient uptake by plant roots. Oxisols are also relatively low in mixed-in organic content. Most of the organic content on the surface of the soil is rapidly decayed and rapidly reabsorbed, and so stuff that takes a long time to develop, like humus, is relatively rare. The humans that were living in the Amazon solved this issue by developing terra preta sometime between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago. The exact process by which it was created is not known for certain. This knowledge has been lost to time. Some possible explanations for how terra preta was initially developed include accidental creation, discovery of the accident, and then intentional application to larger fields, or the discovery of natural terra preta soils followed by their replication and improvement. In either case, let me expand on the list of ingredients that I mentioned a moment ago. Terra preta is fortified up to 9% by mass with charcoal, usually from burned wood, which helps retain nutrients and maintain soil stability. Charcoal, and all types of biochar really, bring nutrients like magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, and calcium into the soil. In nature, a similar effect is achieved through the deposition of volcanic ash, which gets blasted out of the earth, or forest fire ash, which is spread across massive tracts of land by the wind, where the particles eventually settle, deposit on the ground, and get mixed into local soils through the rain and other physical or biological processes like bioturbation. Also mixed into terra preta are crushed bits of pottery, which is basically just clay that's been baked in a big oven. Pottery, in addition to kitchen waste like animal bones, fish scales, and turtle shells, is rich in phosphorus and calcium. And all the manure, all of the compost, and all of the human waste that's regularly added and mixed in is rich in organic carbon, phosphorus, and that particularly important ingredient, nitrogen, in various bioaccessible forms. And carried along with all the manure and the waste are whole communities of bacteria and protozoa and fungi, so the terra preta also has a much denser and more diverse and productive microbial ecology than other nearby oxosol soils. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin used this extremely fertile terra preta to create farm plots, usually only a few acres in size, but up to 2 meters deep. They were typically situated near river systems and areas with decent drainage. Modern estimates suggest about 3.2% of the Amazon rainforest may be growing in terra preta soils. These fertile fields and their agricultural productivity could have supported a large population and would explain the surprising population density described by Europeans in the 16th century. Unfortunately, the arrival of Spanish and Portuguese colonists would destroy these indigenous societies, wiping out their populations with smallpox and other diseases while displacing the survivors. These now nomadic peoples could no longer tend to the terra preta farm plots, and for more than 3 centuries, human contributions to the Amazonian forest soil were interrupted. Other types of anthosols emerged incidentally, as an inadvertent result of other human actions. For example, in cemeteries, ritual burial sites, and even battlefields, the abundance of human remains led to an abundance of humans rotting and leaching their biomass into the ground. These necrosols, or death soils, are rich in organic carbon, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus, and so they're actually quite fertile and conducive to plant and animal life. Here's a morbid little detail for you. The bulk of this calcium and phosphorus enriching the necrosol comes from the breakdown of bones. There are accounts throughout history, from the classical era to the modern day, of battlefields becoming prime farmland. In antiquity, the bones of slain warriors would be packed into a battlefield, where the bodies were pulled apart by animals, and the bones scattered over a wide area and eroded by time. Maybe some of them were ground up into powder by local farmers, specifically for mixing into their soils, but it would have been laborious, and chicken bones work just as well. In World War I, the front lines in Europe were largely stagnant for months and years. This meant that lots of people were being crammed into a series of concentrated areas. This just so happened to be deep trench systems dug into open plains, turned into battlefields by artillery barrages and waves of infantry. Modern weaponry, like artillery, churned up the earth, blasting craters in the soil and displacing huge quantities of material. They also pulverized human bodies, mixing them into the disturbed soil with a ghastly mechanical indifference. In some of the most hard-fought European battlefields, the toxins from all the ordnance rendered the fields not just infertile, but actively dangerous for decades to come. Some of the less polluted battlefields, on the other hand, found their soils enriched with the partially pre-processed biomass of thousands and thousands of people killed in combat. In the subsequent decades, their remains have dissolved and mixed into the soil, making them unusually fertile compared to nearby non-battlefield soils. With our long-practiced and much beloved agriculture, humanity has reshaped the surface of the planet in major ways, perhaps none so drastic and significant in scale than the distribution and chemical treatment of soils. In the modern day, mechanized industrial agriculture is extremely intensive on the soil. It requires unspeakable amounts of water and extensive use of artificial fertilizers to restore the enormous quantity of nutrients that are extracted with each crop. One innovation that facilitated this transformation was the Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation method to produce ammonium nitrate. By using this method to boost nitrogen levels, which were often a limiting nutrient, crop yields could grow much larger and yields could be much bigger. But with greater plant growth comes a greater demand for other nutrients, and so these nitrogen-boosted crops also started to extract proportionately higher quantities of other nutrients out of the soil, like phosphorus and calcium. Crop rotation and intercropping are both very old methods that have been refined and studied as time has gone on. With intercropping, or multiple cropping, two or more different plants are grown side by side, or sequentially, in the same field, so that they can directly benefit each other and achieve mutual boost to their growth and yields. There's a classic example of intercropping that involves the simultaneous cultivation of corn, pole beans, and squash or pumpkins. The pole beans are a type of legume, so they fix nitrogen in their roots, which improves nitrogen content in the soil. The corn provides physical structure for the bean vines to grow on, and the squash or the pumpkins provide a leafy canopy that shades the soil and prevents the growth of weeds. The general idea behind crop rotation is that you can grow certain plant types in a sequence, and each plant type will extract some nutrients, but they'll also replenish the soil in some other way, or provide some ecological service to the other plants. By setting up a rotation of two or more plants that complement each other, farmers can maintain soil health and nutrient levels while still producing robust crop yields. In its oldest and simplest form, farmers would use a two-field system wherein one field was planted and cultivated in one season, while the other field lay fallow, or it went unused. Next year, a crop would be grown in that unused field, while the previous year's crop field would be left unused. It would go fallow. So a fallow field is one that is not plowed or disturbed for the whole year, which allows mycelial networks to regrow, microbial communities to reestablish themselves and expand, arthropod populations to move in, and the soil generally becomes enriched in organic matter and retains more moisture. By growing crops in one of two fields, back and forth, year after year, the fallow field is given time to regenerate and can provide better crops for more seasons farther into the future. Thousands of years ago in ancient China, a three-field system was developed, wherein two types of crops and a fallow state were rotated between three fields year after year. The first field was an autumn or winter harvest of rye and wheats, with a spring-summer harvest of barley or some kind of oat. Usually these spring crops would restore nitrogen to the soil. Then the second field grew peas, beans, or lentils, and the third field was left fallow. Hundreds of years ago in Europe, they developed a four-field system, wherein the fallow state, or the fallow stage of the process, was abandoned, and four crops were rotated across four fields. The four crops are traditionally winter wheat, turnips or some kind of root crop like carrots or beetroot, barley, and clover. The wheat can be grown over the winter season. The clover fixes nitrogen and restores nitrogen levels in the soil, and both clover and barley can be used as feed for grazing animals. The animals will mechanically disrupt the ground with their hooves and leave behind poop that can be mixed into the soil, further enriching it with nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic content. If animal feed isn't necessary, then clover can be replaced with any kind of legume, which are able to fix nitrogen and distribute it throughout the soil via their root nodules. Despite all of these efforts to replenish the soil, modern agriculture is so intensive that soil depletion remains a troubling issue. Monoculture is also a persistent problem, wherein a single type of plant, a single type of crop, is grown over and over and over again in the same area. It's also seen in the use of cloned seeds, or entire fields planted with strains of low genetic diversity, which are vulnerable to pests and diseases, and thus require heavier doses of pesticides and disinfectants, and these come with their own downstream ecological consequences. For example, the heavy use of pesticides is leading to a global collapse of insect populations, which will have dire ecological consequences. This is an example of our own technological power beginning to escape our control, because all of these agricultural chemicals are seeping into the soil. Various pesticides and disinfectants that are sprayed from the air eventually settle down on the ground. If they land on a plant, they get washed off by the rain and they get drained into the soil. Here, these pesticides and disinfectants devastate soil ecologies by killing huge portions of the resident arthropods, annelids, fungi, and microbes. As soil ecology is absolutely critical for the carbon cycle and carbon sequestration, and for pretty much all plants and the entire food web that we all rely on, this industrial destruction of the soil ecology is an extremely serious problem. But it's largely gone unacknowledged. It's not in the mainstream news, and many people worry that the issue is going largely unaddressed. Sure, there's some attention and some resources being given to the problem, but not enough. Not what's needed to actually fix the problem and prevent it from getting any worse, so the issue doesn't metastasize and become way worse sometime in the future. If we look to the future of soil, we'll have to find solutions to these problems. Somehow, we will have to modify our industrial agriculture such that we do not need, or simply do not use, such quantities of pesticides. If we can't figure out some alternative, or some way to restore and protect the soil ecology from our industry, we may experience a future where soil on the world's arable land is so contaminated and damaged that we're unable to grow enough food to feed the teeming masses of humanity. On a more hopeful note, we're also trying to expand into space and colonize other worlds. If humanity is to achieve a permanent presence on another world, like Mars or the Moon, or if we're really dreaming big, on a planet in some distant star system, then we're going to need a soil substrate to grow our food. On Mars, for example, the local regolith is extremely dry, very iron-rich, and saturated with toxic perchlorate salts. A theoretical bioreactor with Schoenella oneidensis microbes could extract the iron oxides and convert them to magnetite, which could be magnetically removed and used as a source of pure iron for construction materials. Then, the regolith sans iron could be run through another bioreactor with microbes like proteobacteria, rhodobacteria, and a Wollanella succinogenes HAP1 strain, as these will all reduce the perchlorates down to safe organic compounds while also producing CO2 and water as byproducts. To some degree, we can use hydroponics and aquaculture to produce food without soil, but both systems have limitations, including the quality of the final product served to our astronaut colonists. And on that metric, soil-grown food beats hydroponic food by a very wide margin. Plus, producing our own soil will be a very effective way to recycle our fecal waste and our compost, so that any spacecraft or planetary colony will be able to achieve a circular, self-sustaining ecological cycle. After all, any off-world habitat will necessarily be its own enclosed ecosystem that will need sufficient carbon to sustain all of its constituent members. An extraterrestrial anthrosol will need to be generated as a substrate to store huge quantities of this carbon and other nutrients when it's not stored in plants or in our bodies. And psychologically speaking, I believe that all spacebound peoples will find immense comfort and joy from feeling soil against their feet. It'll be a sensation similar to stepping out of a plane after a long flight, or stepping off of a boat after a long trip at sea cooped up in your cabin. Think something along the lines of a long-awaited and deeply satisfying existential experience. That's probably what putting your feet in warm sand or soft soil would be like if you've been living in a confined spaceship for weeks or months or maybe even years, where the entire environment around you is artificial and sterile, made of metals and plastics and recycled air. Physical contact with something organic and natural, like soil, would be a welcome reminder to mind and body of our homeworld, our planet of Genesis. After all, the authentic experience of an open sky is just as much an evolutionary birthright as the experience of soft, life-giving soil beneath our feet. Soil is the biome that sustains the world's ecologies, but it's also an irreplaceable psychological symbol, a component of our ancestry, our history, our ties to certain places and certain cultural practices. For all our history, soil has been an integral component to our lives, to our civilizations, and so it will remain, forever into the future. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this special episode on the soil biome. We have gone on an incredible journey through both time and space to examine the evolution and the biology of the soil habitat. If you recall my stated goal at the beginning of the episode, then I certainly hope you now see the soil as the incredible, amazing, complex, and dynamic biome that it is. Let's wrap up with a brief summary of all the topics we've covered in this special episode. In the beginning, we examined the initial evolution of soils and their contribution to the development of the global biosphere. Then we looked at the different structures of minerals, such as sands, silts, and clays, and how they can be combined in various ways to form certain soil types. We discussed the chemical and physical properties of these mineral particle types, a few examples of natural mixed soils like loess or loams, and their benefits and disadvantages with regards to hosting life. This was when we really got into the biological component of the soil organic matter, the humus, including detailed explorations into plant breakdown and soil enrichment. This led to a transition into soil gas and the various organics and volatiles that permeate the soil, thanks to contributions from insects, microbes, fungi, and plant root exudates. All this discussion of the soil flora and fauna led to a discussion of bioturbation in all its many forms, from ants and termites building colonies to boars and walruses digging around for food. And finally, we explored the soil food web, from microbes to vertebrates, and how the soil itself is the base of the greater food web, both in the wilderness and in our agricultural practices. All of the plants that you eat grew in the soil, using their root systems and perhaps fungal symbioses to extract mineral nutrients. All the animals that you eat were either themselves herbivores that ate the plants, or carnivores that ate smaller plant-eating animals. If we trace our steps along the food web going back down to the very base elements, you get down to bugs, to worms, to nematodes, to protozoa, to microbes chemically dissolving plant detritus, one protruding sugar group at a time. We've come full circle, right back to the soil. Truly, it is the foundational biome that sustains and nourishes all others, all terrestrial life on this planet. This is why the soil ranks up there with air and water as an absolutely critical, irreplaceable, invaluable resource for life. If you enjoyed this special episode, then please hit the like button or give a 5-star review. Subscribe to the podcast and support the show by shopping at the official store, or consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. You guys make this show possible. And as always, thank you for listening.